Welcome. My name is Kojo Kumah. I am an organizer for IGDA San Diego. This event tonight is a Freelancer Workshop. We've been planning to do this for a while. And we're going to be talking about freelancing, being self-employed, especially as a game developer or a creative professional. It's incredibly common to do these days. It's something that I did for several years myself. I don't necessarily freelance these days. I still work as a contract employee, but as a W-2 employee, we'll get into some of the differences between the distinctions of that. But the point of this is to offer you all information about what you need to know as a freelancer so that you can do it effectively. You don't have to worry about taxes or business formation and just kind of dispel all of the mystery behind it. All right, so what it's really about is making a living from your skill set. Now, that was the welcome. Okay, so while you're here, there's a few reasons why you're probably here. Either you are a student and you're likely to do some freelance work, especially if you are an AI student. You already are a freelancer, like some of us in the room. I know definitely have done some contract work as artists, programmers, maybe some audio, maybe some writing, like who knows. And also because the game industry has really changed in the last few years. Now this is predominantly focused on game developers. Now it was around 2008 that the whole indie scene really exploded with the advent of mobile phones. Then in 2010, when the iPad came out, things continued to change as well. I think Braid came out in 2008 as well, and that was really heralded as a major success for independent developers. You had a pretty small team, Jonathan Blow and maybe a couple other people, making a very competent 2D platformer and selling millions of copies and making millions of dollars. Then when mobile platforms came out, they were incredibly popular, and you had small teams of people releasing games and being very successful with that. Then it was around 2000, maybe 14 or so, when people started to talk about the indie apocalypse, which is basically market saturation. The tools to create a game have become more accessible and cheaper than ever. I think a lot of us here are familiar with the game engine Unity. Unreal 4 is now free. There's CryEngine, there's GameMaker. There's just all kinds of ways to enter the market now, which is great, because there's so many ways to create products and to express ourselves and communicate with people. But now you're competing with just way more people than there were before. So it's going to get even harder to make a living. Because of that, you're seeing fewer large game studios or even mid-sized game studios continue to stay afloat. Even in San Diego, in the 4 years that I've been here, a number of independent developers have left. A number of studios have closed down. I think we know some of them. And I think because of this, we need to be aware that freelance work and freelance game development is only going to become more common. Now, definitely the industry is going to continue to change in future years. We're coming to the end of this current console generation. So there's already talk about the PlayStation 5, whatever the next Microsoft console is going to be, whatever the next Nintendo console is going to be. So we should be ready to adapt to that. The economy has clearly changed. The Affordable Care Act was like 2010 or so. With that, health insurance became really affordable to people who did not have full-time employment, which is really the main reason a lot of people had jobs in the first place. Definitely without the Affordable Care Act, I wouldn't have been able to afford insurance as an independent contractor when I was living in New York or when I came out to California. And then also, there's this idea of what is called the gig economy, where you have people like Lyft drivers, Uber drivers, people renting their homes on Airbnb, people renting out their cars on relay rides, people doing contract work. Is just way more common than it used to be before. It was kind of a niche thing. So since so many people are doing it, it's good to know exactly what you're doing so you don't, get surprised April 14th and the government asks you for a bunch of money. And then obviously the internet allows people to work remotely. So that's another reason that there's so much contract work these days. I've been on contract teams with people like literally across the world. I've worked with teams in Ukraine, Germany, just the east and west coast of the US. There was a project I was working on last year. I just took a trip to Japan for a month, and I was able to keep coordinating with them. Had to wake up a little early, but I was able to do that. And the reality of that is just something that we should acknowledge, and it's going to make it easier to work for ourselves. You guys get a little preview of all the next slides, so it's not that much surprise. Now, who will be presenting? I will be presenting first. My name is Kojo Kumah. I am a game developer. I've been making games since 2008. I started out working in New York City as a full-time game programmer. Then in around the spring of 2012, I struck out on my own to be a freelance game developer. I've been doing freelance work since about 2017. Recently, I've been working 2 long-term contracts at Sony San Diego. It's not quite freelance work because I'm a contract employee. I'm a W-2 employee, but as we'll find later when Patrick presents, the definition of what exactly makes someone an employee and a contractor can be kind of gray. I don't necessarily consider myself a freelancer because I only have one client. I could have multiple clients, but at this time, I work predominantly for just one. In addition to that, Patrick Klingborg is an associate at Gustafsson and Cersos, I hope I didn't say that right, LLP. He's a business attorney who will be talking about the law of businesses, about business formation, about your business responsibilities, really dispelling a lot of the nuts and bolts about what it means to be employed, what it means to have a business. And then finally, we will have Jeff Godwin, CPA from Intuit. He is a very experienced tax professional working with the TurboTax team. He's also been a leader in industry himself. He's been a CEO, a CFO also, I believe. So he has a lot of insight about, business, money, tax, like the things that excite us and the things that scare us and the things that you guys definitely need to know about. So I want to start out my portion really anecdotally. Patrick and Jeff, these guys are the professionals. So I'm not going to attempt to explain the law. I'm not going to attempt to explain taxes. What I can do is speak from my own experience and tell you what I've been through, things that I've found have been helpful for me, and also relaying information that's been helpful for other freelancers that I've worked with. Now, I don't necessarily recommend any of this information per se, but I think that I have gained certain insights just by doing this, personally, making a living working for myself, and I've learned some lessons the hard way. I've made some good decisions, I've made some bad decisions, but it's really been a learning process. What I wanted to start off with is something that was a challenge for me initially, and that is understanding self-employment. Now, I said again, I started out as a full-time game programmer, and then I quit my job in 2012. Originally, when I quit my job, I was planning to make an independent game, which I think is pretty common, especially if you're going to AI. People want to make their own thing and be creative. And to me, freelancing was just something I was going to do on the back end to pay the bills. Over time, I ended up freelancing more and more until I found myself in a situation where I was only freelancing because my independent work wasn't making any money. That really required a shift in my mind, whereas in my mind, I saw myself as an independent developer, as a creative, an artist or whatever, when really what I was the entire time was a businessman. And I was a bad businessman because I wasn't thinking about it that way. Now, when you are a freelancer, you are not unemployed. You are self-employed. I think that that's a mental shift that it's kind of hard to make sometimes. It can be subtle, but it really informs the way you talk about yourself, the way you talk about what you're doing, the way you think about your time, and the way you relate to other people. It can be something as simple as, let's say you're working at home, and you're working at the kitchen table, and your mom's cooking, and you're working away on some project for a client or something to put on your website, and she asks you to run to the grocery store. Now, to her, you're just sitting at the desk on your computer listening to music, but to you, you're working. And that's very important. It can be really hard sometimes to say, oh, can you leave me alone? I'm working. Like, it may not seem like you are because you're not in an office kind of environment, but even that small mental shift is a very important thing to make. You need to understand when you're working and when you're not working. Because if you don't, you can get into a situation where you're working all the time and you get burned out. You don't have very clear boundaries. Or you're never really working and you're only, losing money essentially. Let's see, you are running a business, you are a small business owner. Indie and startup just means small business. It's something that I like to remind myself of because I think that these terms have a lot of, they have a lot of romance to them. They sound really interesting. Like when you say indie, you might even think a certain type of genre, a certain type of game. It was this way in 2008 or in the early 2000s with music, like an indie band, and then it's sort of, morphed into soft rock or whatever. But the thing is, if you're an indie company, it just means that you're a small business. That's all it means. You have a certain amount of budget, you have a certain amount of capital, you have a certain amount of resources at your disposal. You're competing with all the other companies out there. There's other companies that are big, that are very successful that we don't think of as indie because they were successful before the term existed, and they're so large we don't consider them to compete with us. But a company like Bungie is indie, Insomniac is indie. What's another giant? Rockstar, they're indie. They're not, well, I guess they're owned by Take-Two or 2K. But I think you get my point. Like you're competing with all these other businesses out there, and you need to have that mindset. You shouldn't assume that what you're going to do is going to be, special or successful just because, you want to do something like creative. And I don't want to be disparaging. I just want to be very, very, very clear. You are running a business, and it helps for you to think of it that way. Let's see. You work for yourself. You work with your client. I'm going to be talking about client relationships later on, but I think that's very important to understand as well in terms of interfacing with your client, in terms of communicating with them. Before I was a freelancer, I was just a regular employee, so I really only understood how to work as an employee, in terms of what is asked of you, in terms of what you can ask for yourself, in terms of how to advocate, in terms of what responsibilities you have. So you should also understand that when you are self-employed, you can walk away and the client can walk away from this relationship at any time. It's essentially the same way with employees, but there is a more specific power structure in that relationship. But if you look at it that way, then you can understand that you are bringing something to the table. It's not just that they are employing you by their good graces to do some work for them. You are offering your services and you have input. You have more input than an employee, actually, because you're running a business. Let's see. It is important to create structure for yourself. That can be as simple as having, regular business hours, having a regular place that you work. Time is your most precious commodity. I'm going to get back to that in the structure as well. Invest in yourself. And this is a phrase that somebody told me, I think it was the summer of 2012 when I had recently started freelancing and I was hanging out with some friends who had done the same. He had freelanced for a few years before he started a family, and he said that when he was doing it, the way he thought of it was hunting for his own food. And I really like that expression. It's kind of dramatic and visceral, but I think it really gets the point across that it is up to you to find your work and to get paid so you can pay your rent and so you can buy dinner, so you can go on vacation, do whatever you want. But it is really up to you. It's very scary, but it's also very empowering. It's wonderful. I remember being a freelancer and having a wonderful feeling every day, waking up, just deciding what I want to do. Maybe I'm not going to work today, or maybe I am. And that also might depend on how much money you've made recently. But, it's very empowering to determine everything about your work life, your career, but there's also a tremendous amount of responsibility behind that. And that's something that is best to accept head on. Now, getting back to the earlier points, in terms of creating structure for yourself and investing in yourself, I want to tell a story about how I decided to work at a co-working space. So when I started freelancing for a while, I would just work out of my apartment, just at a desk or at a table I would set up, or if I was at home, I'd work out of our kitchen. And I wasn't always the most productive, but to me it seemed as though I was saving money by not spending money on a co-working space. And then it was one day, a few years into it, I'd already moved to San Diego by that time, where I was working for a client, and in my mind, the workday started at 11, and I wrapped up the workday, or 11 a.m., and I wrapped up the workday at 11 p.m. I'd taken several breaks to, do the dishes and cook dinner and maybe go out. And then when I was finally calculating the hours that I was working during that 12-hour workday, it was maybe 4. Maybe 4 hours of actual work that I felt, would make sense to bill to the client. And it was just a total waste, because to me, I was working that entire day, but I was only productive for less than half of it. So the day was really shot. It's not even like I could have gone out and enjoyed myself, because I told myself I was working. I just wasn't working very efficiently. Now, a friend of mine who runs a local game studio had been offering up a desk just for a co-working space, and I decided to take him up on the offer. He was charging $250 a month, and that seemed like a lot of money to me. That was a significant portion of my rent. That would be several hours of freelance work. But I decided to try it out just to make a shift. And then after I started working there, my rate of productivity compared to the rate I was there just jumped up incredibly. So if I was at the co-working space for 8 hours, I would be productive for 6. Whereas if I was working from home for 8 hours, I'd be productive for maybe 3. And that's not the case for everybody. That's a specific lesson that I learned, and it took a while for me to get to that point, where I thought I was saving money by not spending money on a co-working space. I was actually gaining money by investing in that co-working space, because I was regaining that time and productivity that I could bill to a client. So it's a little counterintuitive for me, but it definitely makes sense. A simpler example for that would be something like lunch. So let's say I'm hungry in the middle of the day, and I can either go down the street to a restaurant to get something to eat, or I can cook something. So I'm thinking, oh, I'll cook because it'll be like way easier to just make something myself. Well, maybe I have to wash the dishes first. Maybe I need to go to the supermarket. Okay, now I need to cook. I need to prepare the food. Now I'm done. I need to do the dishes. What could have been a 15-minute task to go down to the supermarket to spend $15 on some food is now turned into a 3-hour ordeal that I could have billed to my client. I would bill more than $15 in 3 hours. And it's also kind of upset my rhythm for the day. So it's just small little mindset things like that can help you, approach your workday more pragmatically. Can help you appreciate your time and invest in yourself. Now, being a better freelancer, I just want to talk about some things that made me a better freelancer personally. Some of it I didn't necessarily have control over, but I recognized that it was something I could benefit from. So I think definitely having some prior work experience was just a huge leg up. Especially as students, I think that you're going to find it to be challenging to find work as freelancers if you don't have any prior experience. That's part of the reason I think that being part of an organization like the IGDA is so important, because you get opportunities to do game jams, to work on side projects, to create instances of your work that you can point back to and that you can use to demonstrate, your skills. Abandon any romantic starving artist fantasies you have. They're crazy. They're stupid. Don't think, oh, I just want to make games, man, and you don't even have to pay me. I'll just work for that's ridiculous. Be paid for your time. You're worth your time. I don't know where this thing came from, but I find it very often, especially amongst game developers, especially amongst students, and it's very dangerous because you can get taken advantage of. You can find yourself in a situation with a client who can't pay you, or a client who's promising revenue share from a game that probably doesn't have any legs, and you can just end up in a difficult life situation because you undervalued your time, or you're uncomfortable to ask for money, or something like that. But abandon any pretense of being a starving artist just doing it for your craft. You do care about your craft, and you should be paid for your craft. Let's see. Get more comfortable talking about money. That's something I know I had to do personally. And that doesn't mean to be, braggadocious about how much you're making or whatever, but I feel as though there was a certain point when I was talking to a client about how much I wanted to be paid or how much I thought I should be paid, when I realized it was just more comfortable to be upfront about it. I know that, at least for me growing up, talking about money wasn't always something that we did in the house, so maybe that's why I was less comfortable with it. I have friends that's definitely not the case with. But again, you're running a business. You are trading your time for value, so you should be comfortable talking about that and negotiating that. Look up what a competitive rate for someone with your skill set would be if you're just starting out, a junior artist, a junior programmer. If you have more experience, an associate, a senior, whatever, and ask for that. And be comfortable asking for that. Don't just want to rush over that part. Don't let a client try to speed you through that part as well. Take your time. Talk about the money, figure it out so it makes sense to everybody. Don't be uncomfortable with it. Let's see. Understand what it means to be professional. This is kind of vague, but you definitely want to conduct yourself in a way so that people will be comfortable working with you and you will be comfortable working with others. I'm saying this particularly to the students because I've met a lot of the students here, and it can be fun. You're going to art school, you're learning game dev, but a lot of these people that you're interacting with, you might be working with them at some point in the future, especially some of your professors. Don't give your professors a hard time. Don't be rude. Obviously, we all go through things. You're going to have good days and bad days, but the way you conduct yourself around people in your field is very important, especially if you could end up a freelancer at some point. Let's see. Network. It's very important to cultivate a reputation amongst your peers. I know the term networking can seem pretty vague at times, and I feel like I've been pretty good at networking, and I'm not sure why in particular. I don't know if it's something I could communicate specifically, but I will say that I think the essence of it, in terms of building up a client base or in terms of being a better freelancer, is cultivating a reputation. You want to be known where you are amongst your peers. when people say your name in the context of whatever work you do as a programmer, as an artist, as a producer, as a lawyer, whatever, you want them to think that person's good at what they do. Even if they've never worked with you, you want to give off that impression so that when they're hiring, when they're looking for work, they think of you. So whatever that means to you, however you want to manifest that, figure it out. But you want to have a good reputation as someone that, people don't mind being around, and someone that they think that, yeah, they can get the job done. Then the clients will come to you. Let's see. Definitely separate your concerns. This is a mistake I made when I was making my indie game. I wanted to learn a new programming language and make a portfolio piece and sell it and make some money. I had all my eggs in one basket, and the basket, it sunk. The eggs were pretty heavy. I think that some people can do that, but I think it's important to recognize the risk with that. Right? If you do not separate your concerns, then if one of those eggs sinks, they all sink together, and you might be in a difficult situation. So in hindsight, if I were to do it again, I would have approached it 3 different ways. I would have tried to learn in a specific way. I would have worked on a project that I was more confident about releasing in a small amount of time, and I would have started freelancing earlier on. Now, someone else could give you very different advice. Like I know friends who made games in a year or less and released them to great success and fame and glory and all that, but that wasn't my story. So I would recommend separating your concerns just to be conservative and just to be safe. If you're not going to, then just recognize the risk of investing in multiple endeavors at the same time. And keep good records. Keep good records. Keep track of your emails. Keep track of your invoices, your receipts, the things that you buy. You want to have things accessible so you can find them. Have a password manager so you're not using the same password everywhere. It's an easy way to avoid getting hacked. It's not too hard, but make an effort to keep track of everything that is related to your craft and to your work. You're going to want to be able to recall it easily, especially when it's tax time, but especially when you're just going over the stuff that you've done. So keep good records, have an organized file system, back them up however you're going to do it on Dropbox or a hard drive or whatever, but that's something that is worth taking the time to do. All right, let's talk about clients a little bit. How you meet them, a variety of ways. You can go to meetups like this, IGDA events, we do a monthly mixer. Sometimes people will reach out to you on LinkedIn. I've definitely found jobs on Craigslist. There's other web portals like Indeed. You can find clients through colleagues and friends who will recommend you for work, and there's a variety of other ways, but these are some of the methods that have worked for me. Again, as you cultivate more of a reputation amongst your peers, you won't have to look for clients as much. Clients will start to pursue you, and that's really the position that you want to be in. You want to have people coming to you, and you can choose what jobs that you want to take, rather than having to chase things down all the time. And that's not to say you're not going to be looking for work at times. There aren't going to be places that you want to work, but it's always good to know that there's some job offer in your LinkedIn messages that you could really take if you needed to. You might have to move to Minnesota or something weird, but it's good to know that there's always, potentially a job there because people know that, you can do what you do. Let's see. Now your clients. This is very important. Your clients are not your friends. Even when your clients are your clients are not your friends. Okay? You need to keep these relationships separate. Now, I've never really, no, that's not true. So I have had client relationships with someone I have been friendly with, but those situations you have to be very careful about. And the reason you have to do that is because you don't want to enter into gray areas where the relationships become conflated. I have some anecdotes about that I'm going to tell later. I just want to make sure I don't go over my time. But it's just very important that when you're dealing with a client that your interactions with them are very clearly about the work that you are responsible to them and whatever they are owed to you. Obviously, you want to be cordial, you want to get along, you want to be friendly, but you should not misconstrue things. Ultimately, this is a client and freelancer relationship, and it needs to be that first and foremost. It doesn't mean you can't go out to dinner or whatever, but you don't want to get into a situation where they're 2 months behind on paying you, but no, it's cool, man, yeah, let's go see Deadpool. It's like, what? No, you owe me money. No, we're not doing that. So keep those relationships clear. Your clients are not your friends. I'm not going to tell you not to work with your friends necessarily, but I will tell you, beware if your friends want you to work for free. That can be, even if they don't mean it necessarily, that can easily become an abuse of the relationship, right? So be careful entering into work relationships with your friends, just because you need to understand that a professional relationship is going to be distinct from a personal relationship, so it can inform the other. Like if the working relationship isn't good, obviously it can seep into the friendship. If the friendship has some issues, that could seep into the work relationship. I think this is pretty easy to understand. So just have that clear separation and be good about that. Don't add them on social media if you can avoid it. It's just really simple. Clients will try to add you on Facebook or on Twitter or whatever. It can just be, it can create just unnecessary expectations, just kind of too much communication. Like maybe you didn't respond to their email yet, but they see you posting, cat GIFs. That could be a bad look. Or maybe, you're less than professional on Twitter, like some of us are. So I think I'd be careful about that. Keep that to, maybe something like LinkedIn or something that you're more comfortable sharing. And also, you might just have different opinions about things. It could be political opinions or personal opinions, but it's better to keep that separated and to keep things professional. You don't have to be friends with your clients. I would recommend not being friends with your clients. If you can find a way to navigate that, great, but do be careful. Keep your personal relationships separate from your professional relationships, definitely in your mind. Don't get into weird gray areas like I mentioned before. You want to set their expectations appropriately. That's probably the most important part, I think, about being any kind of worker in general. And I forgot who told me this, but it's just such a great piece of advice. Especially as a freelancer, it is so important that you're always setting your clients' expectations to something that you can deliver on. And this goes with my second point, not to say yes to everything. And that's definitely a trap you can get into when you're new in this field. You're happy to have work, you're eager to please, you're maybe, if you're good, you're probably overconfident with your skills, especially if you're a programmer. I know I definitely was. So, the client will ask you to do something that perhaps you've never done, but you have an idea how to do it, and you'll say, oh yeah, sure, I can do that. But if the client asks for something that you haven't thought about thoroughly and you agree to it, now you're in a situation where if you do not deliver on that, you're disappointing them. So rather than them saying, I'll take like an arbitrary example, like, oh, can you, set up a pathfinding for this, object to walk between the rooms? And let's say you've never done pathfinding or whatever. Like, oh yeah, I could figure that out. Oh, could you do that by Friday? I'm like, yeah, sure. Without really thinking about it. Now if you don't have it done by Friday, there's a problem because you've created an expectation that you can't meet. A better answer would be like, that is something I think I could do. Let me look into it, do some exploratory work, get back to you. Like whatever it can be. But the point is, do not say yes immediately unless you know the answer. Be very careful with your words. Be very careful about what you promise. Because if you tell them that you're going to do something and then you don't, then you've sort of broken your word. But if you leave some gray area in there, then that's going to be better because it's going to be more realistic in the first place. And if it continues to be gray, maybe the client will realize, oh, you don't seem super confident about that. Maybe let's try something else. You don't want to be worried about giving off the impression that you're not good or you don't know everything, because no one knows everything. You're going to be able to learn on the job as well. It's most important that you're very upfront, that you're also communicating your ability to learn, because that is also something that is valuable. Let's see. Don't say yes to everything. That's right. Sign a contract up front. Just avoid a sea of headaches going forward. Have clearly defined deliverables about what they want from you exactly. Like sometimes someone will approach you like, oh, can you make a game for me? And you'll say yes. And like, what does that even mean? There's a lot can go into a game. So be very clear about what they want. If they want you to make a certain kind of mechanic, be clear about how it works, what the interaction is, what the feedback is supposed to be. If they want you to make certain art, how many assets, what size should they be, what color should they be, do they animate, yes or no? If they want you to make something, have it very clear exactly what it is you're going to deliver, preferably in the contract so you can do just that. Do not leave it open-ended so you can get into trouble that way. All right, what we got? Some more tips. Keep really good records. I mentioned that before. Budget conservatively. Obviously, you definitely want to do some good budgeting of your, the major expenses in your life in general, your rent, your bills, your utilities, internet, gas, electric, whatever, your phone if you have that, laundry if you have a laundromat, food, fun if you're going to go out and have some fun. But budget conservatively. Don't make a mistake that I did when I came to New York and I decided I could possibly live off of like $2,000 a month. Because when you do that, you just end up losing money every month for a long time until you have to, find some more clients. So, definitely add some cushion to how much you think you're going to need, and you're going to be in a better place. Have an online presence with your resume in a downloadable format and samples of your work. Obviously, you want to have a portfolio, you want to have a website, you want to have an art station or a GitHub or something where people can find your work and access it very easily. Do game jams. Finish the game jam project, get it out there, have people look at it. And then if you have a game jam page up, you can work on it after the game jam, but make an effort to make it look presentable. Add GIFs to it, add screenshots to it. It's really a portfolio piece for you ultimately. So the more impressive you can make it look at a glance, the more useful it's going to be to you. Let's see. Oh, when you're charging hourly, think about what you would pay for. This is something that was tricky for me when I was starting out and not sure how to charge hourly. I've definitely been in situations where I've had clients that have been, less than pleased with how much work they've gotten for the amount of time that someone has charged. And I don't know if there's any hard and fast rules to this, but I would imagine something similar to the golden rule is imagine well, would you pay someone for what you're doing right now, right? Definitely if you have a job, which I think most of us have had at some point, you're not productive 100% of the day. Maybe you take a long lunch break. Maybe you're talking to coworkers in the break room or something. Maybe you just kind of goofing off for a bit. When you're freelancing, I think that those things are going to happen as well. But I think that it helps to make an effort to be fair. One, it'll keep you honest about your work and your estimates, how on task you're going to be, and how long it's going to take you to do something. And also, it's really more fair to the client that way. So, if you're, I think a friend, when he started freelancing, he asked me once, well, what if I, get up to make a sandwich, but I'm thinking about, the algorithm. Should I charge him for that? It's well, how long did it take to make the sandwich, So there's no hard and fast rules about it, but I think, think about what you would pay someone for if they were spending their time doing what you're doing. Let's see. Know that your estimates are probably wrong. That was definitely a problem for me. So if you think it's going to take you 2 days to do something, tell them 4 days or 3 days or whatever seems reasonable, but assume that things are going to go wrong. You're going to need more time to do it. Don't pretend to know anything. Let them know if you're going to need ramp-up time for something. It's very clear. You want to be humble. Always keep improving your skills. Do tutorials, do game jams, do side projects. Always add to your portfolio. Always add to your skill set. Do not get complacent. And stick to your word, so you're very careful about what you promise. I think I mentioned this before. All right, freelancer anecdotes. There's a couple I wanted to talk about. What was the one before I said I was going to mention? What was that? Networking. Gosh, I hope I don't remember it. Or that I do remember it. All right, well, there's 3 off the top of my head. One of them has to do with signing contracts. So this was maybe 2013 or 14, I had started with a client that was recommended to me from a friend. And they had an office in New York City, and I went down there a couple times. They're going to make this Transformers boxing game. It sounded really cool. It's going to be my first Unity game. I was very excited for it. And the guy who I met there, he was really friendly, just talking to him back and forth. We were joking around a lot. And I was waiting for him to give me the contract so we could start working. Now, he hadn't given me the contract yet, even though I had asked several times. And it seemed like we'd already started entering pre-production. We were having meetings about, what people were starting to build, and documents were being written up. And I remember very clearly, it was maybe my second or third time at the office. I was waiting for him to give me a contract. The other guys were waiting for me to go to a design meeting. I said, well, I don't want to start working until I've signed this thing, I trusted him. I assumed that he was going to pay me. He seemed very, lax about it. But, just on principle, I wanted to make sure I had the contract before I started working. I remember we were sitting at a desk, and he was joking with a friend of his who had come in. I said, Josh, can you please give me the contract? And he said, fine, annoyed, as if I was creating an issue. And I think that that kind of thing can definitely be kind of common, especially if you have a friendly relationship with your clients. Now, he did get me the contract after I finally asked for it up front. And I think the first time I invoiced them, like 2 weeks later, maybe their CFO, I'm not sure what his title was, but the guy who managed the money, the first thing that he asked on the email thread was, has Kojo signed the contract? And I said, yes. So like in hindsight, it was very important that I asked, because I might have gotten into a situation where if I felt too comfortable with these guys or it was too gray because it was friendly, I would have done, several hours of work for them, and by the time it was time for me to invoice, maybe there would have been an issue with that. So watch out for that. Another freelancer anecdote is my first job in New York was a game studio called Rebel Monkey, and we had funding from some venture capitalists. We worked for them for about a year, and then we went out of business. When we ran out of money, the owner of the studio didn't tell us that. So I think I worked the month of June 2008, and I didn't get paid. And some of my friends and colleagues worked even longer than that. I think some of them had worked overtime during the holidays, and they were promised money that was just never given to them. Then after that, I worked on a side project and ended up finding another gig with someone who I had met when I was working in that studio. But the owner of that company, he had reached out to me when I was still looking for work, and he told me he was starting up another company, and he wanted me to come work with him. Now, this guy was great. Like, we got along. He was really smart and interesting, and I felt like I owed him a lot because I got my first job in the game industry with him. But I told him, I said, Nick, can you guarantee me a paycheck if I'm going to come work to you? Can you guarantee that you're going to pay me? Because I got to pay my rent. I don't want to go home. I want to stay in New York, this and that. And he couldn't. He pleaded about how strongly he felt about the company and how good it's going to be and all these prospects and this and that. But I just asked him point blank, like, can you guarantee that you'll be able to pay me a salary? And he could not, and I didn't work with him. Now, a number of my friends did, and to this day, he owes a few of them like thousands of, like a lot of money. A lot of money. And the relationship with them is strange because some of them are still friends with him. And I don't necessarily want to judge them for that because, they have their own relationships with them. But in my opinion, as an outsider, that is an abusive relationship. That is a friend who is taking advantage of your friendship to take something from you, your work, your time, your effort. And, I think that all of us in this room could, use a couple $1,000s. Let's see. I don't know if I'm going off time or not. Let me just wrap this up real quick. All right, notes from some fellow freelancers. I'm just going to run through some quick responses that I got. I asked these questions to a few other freelancers I know, some of them in the audience right now. And I just wanted to get their opinion about how they have approached certain things. So the questions were, how do you charge? Hourly upfront pricing? Ever have a retainer? Have you ever renegotiated payment? If so, how do you handle that? Do you license or do you work for hire? Do you have your own contracts? How do you find clients? And have you dealt with royalties or profit sharing? I may not have time to go through all of these, but I'll just run through some and I'll keep it anonymous. Let's see, here's one response. So the first question, usually charge up front or itemized. For me, this variously means calculating by day or by work produced. Piecework as fits the project and task. This is best on explicit bounded contracts, not open-ended work. If that changes, I often renegotiate. I have done retainer too, though it's rarely needed. For the second question, do you renegotiate? Yes, awkwardly. It's better to deal with renegotiating than having a contract that will fall through. Communication is important. Let's see. Do you license or work for hire? Varies. Usually work for hire for contracts that are shorter or have less original creation involved. I prefer licensing whenever possible, even if it can be a pain to set up. I think Patrick's going to talk about the difference between licensing and work for hire, which can be very important, especially if you're an artist or a programmer and you want to, use an algorithm that you wrote again, or you want to reuse a character that you made before or something like that, for example. Let's see. Do you have your own contracts? No, because I'm lazy and not actively pursuing freelance gigs. I'll draft a simple one if the employer doesn't have one. Good to know what terms you want to have in your contract, though. How do you find clients? They've always found me, often by referrals. This is how I avoid freelancing. And have you ever dealt with royalties or profit sharing? Yes. I've never seen a rev share from my freelancing, though I write them for my own projects fairly often. And I'll just do one more. How do you charge? Upfront charge, usually an agreement of what is needed or what is to be done is outlined in the contract, and if any additional meshes or art needs to be done, I'll bring it up and mention this before I get started. Let's see. Have you ever renegotiated payment during contracts? I have triggers in my contract that initiate a meeting to negotiate a new rate or additional work. Normally, I do not renegotiate contract work. If someone is unable to pay me the agreed upon stuff, I give them equivalent of what they are able to pay me and keep the rest. Basically, if they ask for more, every asking of more is subsequently more expensive as I have to budget more time around, that time that I've already budgeted. Let's see. Licensed work or work for hire. I do work for hire, piecemeal work. Do you have your own contracts? I have my own contracts that I use. Framework from an older version of the IGDA contract. It has caused issues when a client's contract backfires, when a client backfires on their own contract. Theirs does not fully indemnify yours if their contract does not fully outline that it does so. I think Pat could talk about that as well. Yeah, this guy knows more about the law than I do. It gets complicated quickly. I usually will either sign one or the other, but have been in situations where both were in play. Let's see, how do you find clients? Local work usually. Someone I know needs to do work done and I can do it. Have you done royalties or profit sharing? No royalties or profit sharing so far. There's some more answers to this. I will post them anonymously with an updated version on the slide after this talk. And oh gosh, I didn't give you guys an outline for the talk. So I'm talking first, and I'm going to be done. Then Patrick's going to talk about business law. We're going to take a little 15 intermission where we're going to tell you guys about one of our sponsors for today, Hitmarkers, the biggest job boards for esports games. Then after that, Jeff is going to present about taxes and business. And then we're going to have some Q&A where you guys can ask any questions about any of the speakers we've had so far. So that's been my presentation. Thank you.
And I've titled my presentation Legal Issues in Tech because a lot of these issues are applicable to anyone, and I think they would all be applicable to you all. Just a little bit about myself and my firm. We're what's called a mid-sized firm. We've been in San Diego for 30 years. The reason I'm telling you we're mid-sized is I think that's a really good sweet spot. We represent one-person companies, and we represent larger companies. Sometimes we defend Walmart, Target, all kinds of big companies. We do pretty much everything. We're full service, and the region we're in is kind of the Southwest. Again, we're founded in San Diego, and that's where our main office is. Kind of our unofficial motto is big firm service without the big firm fees. I don't know how familiar you all are with law firms. I know a lot of people like to joke like, well, you know, like hopefully I don't need you as a lawyer, right? And yeah, that's true. And you know, nobody likes to get sued. I think the thing that people don't often realize is a little bit of work with a lawyer up front can actually help prevent you from getting sued. So it's actually not bad to know a lawyer and to deal with them because that can prevent a lot of trouble for you. Just to add a little more details onto the fees, you know, a larger law firm that's got, you know, 250 or more lawyers all over the U.S., you'll be looking at, you know, it depends, but maybe $500 an hour on up. You know, our fees depend, and we like to be flexible and work with people, but, you know, we can charge somewhere around $300 an hour, maybe a little less, maybe a little more. And I think that's actually pretty competitive for the San Diego area. And the reason I'm saying that is not because I think it makes me sound cool, but because I think if you implement some of these pieces of advice that I'm about to give, you can prevent yourself from needing a lawyer when it's going to cost a lot more to clean up a mess than it will to prevent it. Of course, I wouldn't be a good lawyer if I didn't have a good, you know, legal disclaimer in there. So if you know you do need my help, give me a call. Happy to talk to you about it. But what I don't want to hear is, you know, in 6 months, someone saying, "Well, I went to this presentation where Patrick was, and you know, I know all of it now, so he's my lawyer." I would love to be your lawyer, but I can't be your lawyer just by your attendance at this workshop, though I do appreciate it. So we're going to talk about a few of these things. There are a lot of topics here. And, you know, I may not get to all of them. To give you a complete overview of business law, you would need to go to law school. so that, obviously that's not what tonight is. But my goal is to give you enough that you can identify some pitfalls and stay away from those things, or know when when you need to look more into something. So that's kind of my thoughts. If there is something else up here that you don't see that you want to talk about, let me know, and we can certainly get into that. This first issue is, the term freelancer. When Kojo was doing his presentation, I was thinking, well, in my mind, I've got a legal mind, I always think of a freelancer as an independent contractor, which is a legal term. And it's significant in that it's different than an employee. When you were giving your talk, though, it kind of brought to light that, well, I guess you could be a freelancer and an employee too. So I think that term can mean different things to different people. I can tell you that as far as the law goes, there's a big distinction between what the law terms an independent contractor and an employee. And I think most people know generally that distinction is out there. I don't think they always know what it means. And there's a little overview up here. I think to kind of understand it, the history helps. Many years ago when we, as a society, started determining, hey, it might be good to have regulations on the number of hours people can work and whether children can work in coal mines and all those kinds of things. There was this thought that, well, if you were an employee, you were just kind of this minion, this grunt, right? You didn't really have any intrinsic value. You could just be plugged into any old factory or something, and you would just do whatever you're told. Whereas, the people who really have value and who are professionals, they dictate their own terms. They don't need protection from work week hours or from working conditions or anything, because these are doctors, these are lawyers, these are these very specialized, skilled people. Nowadays, that construct doesn't really hold up, right? I mean, doctors are employees, lawyers are employees, software developers are employees. So, but back when these laws first arose, the thought process was, well, we need to protect these helpless little employees because they don't know any better, they don't know anything. And so we have various laws that I think most people consider good, like minimum wage, overtime, payroll taxes, that stuff like contributing to unemployment insurance. So that way, if you're fired through no fault of your own, like you're laid off, you can collect on unemployment, which can help you transition to your next job. All of those things, they don't apply to independent contractors. And a lot of times, companies will classify two people who work right next to each other, the same desk in the same office, who do more or less the same thing. One person will be an employee and one will be an independent contractor, which could be a big problem, right? Because one person has all these protections, another person doesn't. So that's the significance, is there's a lot of laws that won't apply to you if you're classified as an independent contractor, and a lot of people are wrongly classified. Just a little bit more about that. It's a big impact. A lot of businesses do it. I have people say all the time, well, no, it's fine. They agreed to be classified as an independent contractor. We're all set. They signed the contract. And it's not that simple. I think that's what people don't realize, is it's not just what you agree. You can agree that a person is an independent contractor, but that's not how the law works. The law looks at what is the actual working relationship between those two people. A lot of that, and we'll kind of get into that a little bit later, but a lot of it is control. If it's something where I say, please build me a game, I want it to be about spaceships with a raccoon as the main character, and that's it. That's kind of like an independent contractor relationship. But if you're really in the details about the game, maybe you're meeting with them often, maybe you're telling them, no, don't do it this way, don't do it that way, you're exercising more control over them, that makes it more likely an employee relationship. And that's what the court looks at, is what were you actually doing every day, not what did your contract say. They couldn't care less about that. So, and there's a big reason why businesses do it. They save a ton of money, right? So when you're an employee and you get deductions from your paycheck, those deductions aren't just from your paycheck. for some of those things, and I'm sure Jeff could talk about this a little bit more, the employer will contribute some out of their own money. So if they classify you as an independent contractor, they don't have to make that extra contribution. So they can save on overhead, which could give them an advantage over other businesses. So it's a real, tempting way for a business to save a fair amount of money by saying, well, why don't we just call half these people independent contractors? We'll be able to stay above water, whereas, Acme Co. across the street won't. I wanted to let you know how much California thinks they lose in payroll taxes, which is $7 billion, because that is an incentive for plaintiffs' lawyers. A plaintiff is the person who's suing in a lawsuit. That is an incentive for them to sue you if you are misclassifying your workers. Most of these lawsuits over this misclassification issue, the plaintiff doesn't get a ton of money. The lawyers do. So when I see people say, oh, well, it's just a little bit of money, it'll probably be fine, they'll go away. They might, but their lawyer may also push them to sue and sign up other workers that have been misclassified. So that's just something to be aware of. And the consequences are huge. You really get nailed for these things. So obviously you'll have to pay anything you should have paid if you classified them correctly. Like, if it turns out that they wouldn't have earned at minimum wage, you got to pay that. If they weren't getting lunch breaks, you got to pay for that. Any taxes, insurance premiums, that kind of stuff. And the real kicker is, and this is a general exception to the law, at least here in the United States, is that if the other side wins, meaning if they're right that as a business owner you misclassified them, you got to pay both sets of attorney's fees. You got to pay your own, and you got to pay the other person's too. And that alone could be more than all the taxes and wages and all the other things. So it's best to stay out of this kind of trouble because it's just a huge cost. So all right, we know it's important. You get it. What is it? Well, this is an interesting timing for this presentation, not by accident. On purpose, but the law has recently changed in this regard. And it changed at least in California, via California Supreme Court ruling on April 30th, 2018, so just about a month ago. Before, we had this kind of patchwork of laws. This is part of the old test. There were these 10 or 11 factors. And a lot of these things, again, if you kind of look through them, they're trying to get at how much control was the employer exercising over the worker. The more control, the more likely the worker is to be an employee. Less control, the less likely the worker is to be an employee. And the thing about this factor test is there wasn't like a strict equation for how to apply them. It was just, hey, you need to consider all of these things. And lawyers would argue all of these things. And in some ways, it could be good for both workers and employers because, of these 11 things, probably a few of them are going to go in your favor, right? Or at least you can make them close calls. So it kind of created a little bit of a gray area. It was one of those situations where, they tried to provide guidance by giving all of these detailed factors, but it really just made it more difficult to determine, well, what is this worker, an independent contractor or an employee? Because it was a complex analysis. So this test was from 1989, which further confused things because we didn't have the gig economy back then. We didn't have apps back then. We didn't have the type or scope of software development we have now back then. So this was a test that really didn't fit reality anymore. So this is our new test, which again is from about 30 days ago. First of all, it's not just consider these factors. It's you need all three of these factors. If you miss out on one, it's over. The other thing that's been made clear is the business owner. It's on them to establish this. So I'll just go through them real quick. So that the worker is free from the control and direction of the hirer. We kind of touched on this a little bit. And note that the court specifically put that it's not just what the contract says, it's what actually happens, right? So you can't just get around this by saying, well, our contract says, you agree that I can direct your work and that you can do whatever you want. And you can write that in the contract, but then if day one you're telling the worker, this is what you need to do, this is how you need to do it, that doesn't fly. That's not what reality is. Second factor is the usual course of business. So this is a big one. So like an example I'll give is I work at a law firm. If I hire a website developer to make me a website, well, I'm not really in the business of websites. I'm in the business of law. But if I hire, let's say I have a big case and I need another attorney for a month, and I say, hey, I'll hire you to do some attorney work. Well, now the person that I'm hiring, even though with both examples, the idea is, hey, let's just work for a little bit on this specific project. The attorney that I'm hiring is doing legal work, which is my core business. The website developer is doing website work. That's not my core business. And this could get kind of confusing still. So, again, this decision is 34 days old, so we don't have any further precedent on this specific factor for this specific test. But let's say it's like a marketing agency. Do you have a question?
Yeah, so basically, if you're going to work and they're doing the same service, they're technically, they have their employee.
Yes.
It's something completely irrelevant, say, a website for restaurants.
Mm-hmm.
You're basically, they're in your employee.
Yes. Yeah. And so now this used to be a consideration in the old test, but it could be outweighed by the other things. Now it's like an all or nothing. You got to meet all of them. But it could still get into gray area, right? Like let's say you're a marketing agency and you have a graphic designer. Well, marketing agencies probably have something to do with graphics, but I don't know. Maybe your marketing agency is really focused on, I don't know, radio ads. It's probably a poor example, but the point is you could foresee some situations where it's not clear whether or not this person that's being hired is doing something pertaining to your usual course of business or not. But I think that's a big one that people are going to have trouble with, is because they think, oh, I'll just hire some developers for this game, or for this month, or for this tax season, or whatever it is. And if it doesn't matter if it's a temporary assignment or temporary project. If they're doing what your core business is, then they're an employee. And then this third one is, is the worker outside of the relationship with the employer, are they engaged in their own independent business? If they're not really, then it doesn't really seem like they're kind of like a freelancer. That's kind of where we're going to come back to this, right? Like a true independent contractor would be what I think is like a true freelancer, which is they've got multiple clients, right? And if they're coming to your office 9 to 5 every day, they're also doing other stuff on the weekends for other clients, or maybe at night, that kind of thing. So now you need all three of these things. And I know that maybe more people in this room are more on the worker side than the employer side. This is still something for you to watch out for too. I think a lot of people are misclassified as contractors, and you may have the right to sue. So keep that in mind. I was talking with Jeff earlier about some people actually like being an independent contractor because you can deduct certain tax expenses and whatnot. So it'll be kind of interesting to see how this shakes out. But this is the new test. Yes.
What would the word customarily mean? Oh, sorry. So what would the word customarily mean for Part C of these, established things you need to be?
The word customarily right here?
Yeah.
Well, I think they just want to see that you've got your own business, which again could be tough, right? Like, if you've got one client that you work 30 hours a week and another client you work 5 hours a week, does that mean you have your own business because you have this other client that you work 5 hours a week? I'd argue yes, right? But what if 2 quarters out of the year you don't have any other client, you just have one? But then 2 quarters you do have a second client. Is that enough? I don't know. This is what the court left us with. So, at the end of the day, they think that an independent contractor is someone who has their own business.
Thank you.
Sure.
That doesn't count if you're a LLC or corporation, right?
So that's a good question. I would disagree. I don't think it's clear, but I've heard people say, oh, it's fine. We'll just set up an LLC. We'll have the employer bill the developer's LLC. that means it's a separate business. Magic bullet. I don't think it's quite that simple. I know that helps. Under the old test, courts have said, well, if you have your own entity, that helps show that you're your own business, which helps show that you're an independent contractor. But I suspect that issue will come up eventually. And I think that the court will look at everything and say, well, wait a minute. If you only worked for this one person or this one business all year, you were there 9 to 5, you had a desk, you did similar work as other employees, you otherwise met these factors, but you had the company bill your LLC, or your LLC invoice the company and the company pay your LLC. Is that a way you can kind of circumvent this and say, well, no, I'm an independent contractor because I have my own business? I don't think so. I don't think it would work like that. I think, this prong B, I think you would have trouble getting around that, right? Because, if you're still doing the same work, you're just having an LLC invoice the company. I don't think that would be enough to overcome prong B. But I think that's a good question because that's how a lot of people do it. In fact, some companies will say, we won't hire you as an independent contractor unless you have your own entity. You have to have an LLC. You have to have an S corp. And I think under the old test, that was a pretty good way to for the hirer to protect themselves from the worker saying, "Hey, I was misclassified." But I don't think it's that clear anymore. Again, this is a very timely time for me to talk to you because this was a huge change in law that just happened. Do you have a question? So a lot of times contracts will address that.
As a freelancer as well.
Yeah. A lot of times a contract will say, yeah, you're in California, I'm in New York. We're going to agree that this state's law will apply. Maybe not. I know.
What would be a default then, like if it doesn't, say that?
Yeah, it can be tough. Usually it could be where the contract was made, or where the work was performed, or where the work was delivered. So, and both sides would argue that is a major point of contention in a lawsuit sometimes. There could be, each side could spend 20 grand in attorney's fees researching and arguing why this state's law should apply or this state's law should apply. So it's not always a clear-cut default. It's always where the worker is. It's always where the employer is. It's not always clear. So the question is, can indications in the agreement, such as a statement that I live in San Diego, does that automatically mean that San Diego or California's law applies? And the answer is no. It's very common to have a provision in the contract stating both parties agree that this contract, and any disputes arising out of same will be governed by the laws of the state of California or the state of New York or whatever it may be. I would always recommend being clear about that because, like I said, you can spend a lot of money arguing which state's laws apply. Yes. Yeah, again, it's not clear. I think the employer, if they thought that Oregon law was more favorable, which again is a big issue. A lot of times people do what they call forum shopping in at least attorneys do. And they decide, well, there's arguments for both of these states' laws to apply. Let's research the law and see which one is more likely to give us a favorable outcome, and we'll argue that state's law applies. It's not always that the employer is thinking, we want our home state law to apply because the courthouse is across the street. That doesn't matter. If you've got a more favorable law in the other state, the employer may be arguing that the worker's state of residence law applies. So again, I would highly recommend specifying in the contract this state's laws apply. Probably, so the question was if you're engaged with a contract with someone out of state, right, and the other state's laws apply, right, and a lawsuit arises, do you have to travel to that other state? Right. And the answer is you probably would a little bit. There's a lot that can be done. You can appear before a court hearing via phone. So that helps. A lot of documents can be served electronically, so that helps. But not all of them. Usually to serve someone with an initial lawsuit, you got to hand it to them in person, which could be done through an attorney service or other couriers. But there would be things like showing up for certain court hearings, or heaven forbid it proceeds to trial, that you would have to go there for. So that's something to take into account. So I had a business dispute for a big client here in San Diego, and long story short, the forum selection clause said the Texas law applies because my client's counterpart, the opposing party, was based in Texas, and any lawsuit must be filed in Austin, Texas. And the dispute was over like 10 grand. And I told him, I said, well, here's the thing. I think, to my client, I said, I think you got some pretty good arguments, but there's an attorney's fees clause in the contract, which means if they win even a little bit of money, they get all their attorney's fees. And it specifies that we got to go to Texas to file suit. So, you can fight them tooth and nail, and maybe you'd win and owe them $0, but you're going to have to go to Texas to do that, which is going to eclipse $10,000 pretty quickly. So I'd recommend just paying them a little bit of money and being done with it. So these clauses are very important, and that's a great reason why. All right. So again, I just want to emphasize that the impact of these issues are really significant. There's a ton of liability. And whether you're on the hiring side or you're on the worker side, it's something that you should be aware of. You may have a claim if you're a worker. You may be exposed to claim if you're an employer. So, and I can't overstate how common it is for people to be misclassified. You may want to consider, and I think maybe after Jeff's portion, you'll have a better idea for, maybe I am misclassified, but maybe I don't care. Maybe you like some of the things associated with that. But it's extremely common. There's a lot of misinformation about it, and it really just depends on how you all are interacting with each other on a daily basis. You could start out legitimately being an independent contractor, and then over time, as the employer starts saying, well, actually do this, well, I don't like this, they may become more involved, and you may just kind of automatically convert one day into being an employee without ever knowing it. So.
Are there consequences to the contract?
There can be, like, for example, if the contractors, and again, this is probably getting a little bit into the CPA realm. Again, I'm not a CPA, so I cannot provide tax advice, but we do have one here. I would imagine perhaps you might have to pay back any deductions you improperly made. If you're making business deductions and you're not really your own business, you're really an employee, that could be problematic. Usually the problems are from the employer's standpoint. Yeah, that's the big one that comes to mind. I usually don't see that as a big issue. Here's a few resources. Like I said, there's a lot of misinformation out there. These are government websites, and some of them have some pretty good hypothetical examples. So I would stick to resources with .gov in their URL because while they're not going to answer all your questions, you can be pretty assured that information is pretty accurate.
So you mentioned that there was these clause A, B, C, I guess. We'll just call them that for the sake of brevity. Were established April 30th. Are any of these
Followed differently under arbitration?
Okay. They shouldn't be. So for those who aren't familiar, arbitration is kind of a scary sounding word. What that means is it's like a private court process. So hopefully, few of you are familiar with lawsuits. They take a long time and they're really expensive. And as a result of that, something people came up with many years ago was, well, what if the parties all agree that we don't get our day in court, we'll just use a private person to resolve our disputes. And this is a very common thing. That private person is usually a retired judge or an experienced attorney. And a couple advantages of it, or it's streamlined. You don't have to wait for all the backup in the courts. and it's private. Anything filed in a lawsuit in court is public record. Things filed in arbitration are not. So, for example, a lot of companies have come under fire recently for saying if you sue us for sexual harassment, that has to go to arbitration. And there's been a lot of backlash because people say, well, wait a minute, you shouldn't be trying to sweep stuff under the rug. This is an important issue, and society, at least here in the U.S., is recognizing that more and more lately. So those types of things should be open, right, not subject to arbitration. In an arbitration, and again, anytime you're going to arbitration, it's because it's been agreed to in some sort of contract. Kind of a criticism of arbitration is that, like with a big company, like a lot of cell phone providers say, you have to go to arbitration. As I said before, the arbitrator, the person who's the judge in this arbitration, they're a private person who is paid money to perform this service. So if you're a big company like T-Mobile or AT&T, and out of the millions of subscribers, maybe 1,000 of them will go to arbitration. Well, one tactic you might use is you always go to the same 3 or 4 or 10 arbitrators, and if those to handle your disputes. And if those arbitrators know, well, hey, AT&T is giving me 10 cases a year, and by the way, arbitrators can make anywhere from like $500 to $1,500 an hour, so they make a lot of money. Who do you think the arbitrator is probably going to side with more often than not? A criticism would be, well, they're going to go to the person who's referring them all this business, not all these random cell phone subscribers who they're probably never going to see again, whereas they are going to see AT&T or T-Mobile or whoever their kind of main source of referrals is. So some people think arbitration is kind of biased towards the larger companies that send the arbitrators all this business. But this is a long-winded way of answering your question, which is to say that arbitrators are supposed to apply current law. I guess it's possible you could stipulate otherwise. I don't think a court would enforce that. So yes, the dynamics test, which was just recently handed down by the California Supreme Court, should apply in arbitration just the same as it would apply to a lawsuit in court. Sorry for all the additional wind there. Was there another question? Unemployment? No? Okay. If you think of anything else.
Walk up to the mic, just have him repeat the question.
Yeah, that works.
So you mentioned some discriminatory laws that independent contractors are not protected under. Does retaliation, does that still fall under independent contractors as a law protected by
I don't
them?
think that would. I can double check for you, but I don't think so. I think it would depend because the law for independent contractors is actually a lot more complicated than I outlined. There are kind of different tests when we're talking about federal laws. There are federal laws that prohibit discrimination. There are state laws that prohibit discrimination. So it's possible you may be an independent contractor under California set of laws, but for the purposes of a federal statute, you may actually be an employee. And then for the purposes of California tax commissioner, you may be back to independent contractor, even though the California law in another area says you're an employee. So it's really this patchwork of laws that is very confusing. Okay, so let's talk about intellectual property, another thing which could be 2 semesters in law school, but I'm going to try and give you a little overview here. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with this phrase. There's 3 main types of intellectual property. We've got patents, trademarks, and copyrights. A patent is like an invention. It's like a new or novel, useful process, method, machine, something like that. Patents are probably not something you'll see a ton of. It's possible to patent software, but it can be difficult. Another thing with patents is you got to keep the subject of the patent secret until you have the patent, which takes 6 to 18 months because you're dealing with the government, so it's going to be slow. And again, you've got to keep your invention secret during that time. So it might be better for you to just put it out there and start getting customers. Or maybe not. If you really have something super secret and super great, then maybe it is worth it to keep it secret instead of marketing it. trademarks, it's like a logo, a slogan. It can be a picture, it can be a word. Sometimes it could even be a color. For example, there's a fancy shoemaker called Christian Louboutin, and they've got these, they make women's shoes, and they've got these red soles. And they have established that everybody associates the red sole of a high heel with us. And they have actually been able to essentially trademark that and prevent other people from doing it. And then lastly, we've got copyright, which I think is probably most applicable to you all, because that would apply to software code. Copyrights, any sort of expression in a fixed medium, right? So it could be a musical score, it could be a painting, it could be code, it could be a book, those types of things. So sticking with copyright, because I think that is most applicable here. What a lot of people don't realize is when you write something, you own the copyright in it, right then and there. I developed, why don't we, kind of try and build off of this? And you do that, and you become wildly successful, and maybe that person kind of drifts away. But once they hear that you're wildly successful, they come back and say, all right, well, let me know when I can pick it up. And you say, pick what up? They're like, well, my shares for 33% of the company, because I gave you the code, and now it's really popular. They do own it if they wrote it. And again, they don't have to do anything. So just by way of creating it, they automatically own it. So if you've got I think a theme throughout my presentation is, and Kojo kind of touched on this, is keep good records, right? So best thing to do would be kind of establish this stuff earlier so you don't have to worry about it. But that is the default under law. Kind of a way around that is what's called a work made for hire. And the idea there is if an employer hires somebody and says, make me this game with this raccoon flying spaceships, because it's within the scope of the employee's work, then we've got an exception. Now the employer owns the copyright, right? So that's different than the normal scheme. And then there's another way to do it too, which is maybe the person writing it isn't an employee, but if it was specially commissioned, then still the person who wrote the code wouldn't actually own it. It would be the person who's commissioning it. Well, let me continue with that. Let's say I am, so you sketch. So let's say I say, hey, I'm making a Disney movie. And we need to have like the wacky sidekick. There's always a wacky sidekick in there. And I say, give me 4 mock-ups. Maybe a giraffe, an elephant, a zebra, and an alligator. And we end up going with the alligator. But you've provided me with the other 3 animals. And, there's, different angles. They look kind of cute. And I would argue that if it's a work for hire situation, I own all of those, even though the real product was only the alligator. Right. Well, so that's an interesting point, because I think if I specially commit, that kind of goes to this one. If I specially commission, if I say, hey, I want 1 wacky sidekick character, and you give me the 4, and we decide on the alligator, then I think you're right. I would only own the alligator. But if I say, hey, I'm an employee who's an employee, you're going to be a sketch person, then that's different, because within the scope of your work is to create characters, generally speaking, for me. Yeah, that's a good point, and that's part of what at least us lawyers will refer to sometimes as a belt and suspenders approach, which, the belt would be, well, hey, if you're the employee and this is within the scope of your work, I'm going to own it, so I'm covered. But just in case, let's throw in another clause saying, even if somehow I don't own it by default operation of law here, you agree that you'll assign it to me anyway, so I can get you either way. So that's a little bit different, but same realm here. And I think you're right. In practice, a lot of people are going to have that anyway. So I don't know that it's really going to make that big of a difference, because they're going to get you any way they can.
So this is all
Sorry, how am I doing on time? Am I almost over? Okay. Yeah, here we go. So this is kind of the two ways you could have a work made for hire, right? It could be, if you've got an employee situation, or, I think the second prong is really like an independent contractor situation. Like, well, you're not an employee. It may not be really like within the scope of your general 9 to 5 working, but if I specially commissioned you to create, X, then I can still own X even if you're not my employee. So here's kind of like a little summary. I think this bottom part is where you got to watch out. You've kind of got one of these gray areas that Kojo was cautioning against. Like, well, we don't have a formal relationship. So they're not my employee, or I'm not an independent contractor, but this person creates the code. Well, again, you kind of have to start at the beginning. Well, if they created it, they own it. Now, again, a lot of this stuff can be contracted around, which is kind of the reality nowadays, and that's okay. But I think what gets lost in all that is what these default rules are. And the penalties here can be severe too. I would say they're probably, it depends. I think the misclassification lawsuits are probably more common. Copyright penalties could be more severe. The first two, just to provide a little color of those. So if this cute alligator that you create for the Disney movie, if you end up taking it and you sell it to Pixar or some other company, and my movie, the box office sales dip right when the other movie comes out with the pirated alligator character, and I can say, well, I was damaged. The demand for my alligator went down. So you need to make me whole. You need to do what would put me where I would be if this infringing work never came out. On top of that, I can say, and on top of that, give me all your money that you made from your movie, right? That's the additional profits of the infringer. That would also get. Another way they tack on penalties to say, well, apart from all that, we'll just throw on some extra gravy on top. That's the statutory damages. And then, of course, you've got all these attorney's fees you've got to pay too. So, be careful. Any other questions about IP, copyright? Again, very broad topic, so I'm trying to brush with broad strokes here. Okay. All right, so how much time do I have? Like 5 minutes, 10 minutes? Oh, well then I know Jeff's going to talk about some of this stuff, so I could probably skip this.
I went long, and I feel like all of this is really great. Like, this is why we're doing it. So, if folks don't mind staying longer, I'll be offended.
Okay. Well, I'll try and go quickly. And I know, I think it's really great, first of all, that you all are at this presentation, that the powers that be organized it. But also that we've got both a lawyer and a CPA. I tell all my business clients, you got to talk to a CPA. You need to have a CPA. If you don't have one, I'll recommend you one, because they really work hand in hand. And they overlap with each other. They just have different perspectives on things. So if you take anything away from this presentation is you can't just consult a CPA and you can't just consult a lawyer. You really got to consult both of them. Corporate strategy, Kojo was talking about how you need to think of yourself as a business. Well, when you really get serious as a business, you'll need to think about maybe a business form. Why form an entity? An entity, these are things like a corporation, an LLC, that kind of thing. The number one thing is a corporate veil, right? So if I have a business and someone comes into the lobby because they want to ask me to create a video game for them, and they slip and fall, and I don't have an entity, well, and they win in court against me, well, that judgment's coming out of Patrick Klingborg's pocket. If I have an entity, that's coming out of my business's pocket. So my house is safe, my car is safe, my savings are safe. So that's pretty big source of protection. Kind of I think a secondary benefit is when you have an entity, if you're doing it right, you're also setting up basically a constitution, a Bible, a set of rules for your specific entity. there's a reason for those. They can be kind of burdensome to comply with, but in the end, these are rules that have been developed through society and law for hundreds of years, and they help. They help you run a company. They help you make decisions, sometimes hard decisions, but decisions nonetheless. So what I'm going to do, because the different types of entities are really confusing, is go through them very quickly, and I'm going to analogize them each to an emoji, because I think maybe that will bring a little bit of color to an otherwise pretty boring topic. So the first entity type is sole proprietorship. And in this really fantastic analogy, we're going to think about how when you're exposed to the elements in these different modes of transportation, it's like you being exposed to liability, right? Like we gave the example of, well, you could have to pay the judgment out of your own pocket. So sole proprietorship, if you start working for yourself, you don't have to do anything. You don't have to file anything. You don't have to say anything. You are automatically a sole proprietorship. That is one person, working for profit. That's just a fancy way of saying freelancer, I guess. It can be. If you're going around the block, it may not matter that you're only riding a bike, right? You may not need a lot of protection, and some of that protection can be achieved through other means without an entity like insurance or that kind of thing. So it's a simple form, but hey, it gets you moving. The next type would be a general partnership. That's again something automatically created. You don't have to file anything. And that's anytime you have two or more people working towards a profit. You can probably get a little more done and go a little farther, like as a motorcycle is to a bicycle. But you could still get rained on. You could still get chapped by the wind. You could still get sunburned. But you can go a little farther. Next type, I've got a car for a limited liability company. Here, you have some protection. You got a roof over your head, right? It costs a little bit more to set up a limited liability company. You got to file something with the state. You're going to have additional things you need to do to keep your taxes straight. But you do have that corporate veil. So if you're running it right and someone sues you, it's only the LLC that's going to be at risk, not you personally, which again is the big benefit to setting up an entity. Next is a corporation. An S corporation has to do with the tax election, but it does create some limitations as to how many shareholders and other things you can do with the corporation. So I've got a bus here. Again, you've got that corporate veil. You're protected from the elements. You can have a lot of people in on it. Maybe not the most, but you can do a lot with that. Again, if you're just going around the block, so to speak, you may not need an S corp. Maybe the bicycle is appropriate for you. So it's kind of different tools for different jobs here. And then finally, I've got the rocket ship. This is like a true tech startup. This is set to really take off. You've got all the shackles are off as far as number of shareholders and whatnot, and there's different tax obligations, which I'm sure Jeff will talk about, and maybe they are a little more onerous, but at the end of the day, you can do the most with this. Again, if you're going on a short road trip, you probably don't need the expense or complication of a rocket ship. Same, with a C corp and a small business, maybe you don't need all that. But if you really want to fly high, then this is the best vehicle for you. Any questions about that extremely quick overview of different corporate entities? Yes.
Can you change from if you're a limited liability company, can you file for a C corp?
Yeah, you can convert. In theory, it's probably better to pick the right entity right off the bat, but you can convert. Yeah, you can. I mean, it'd be easier to set up the C corp in the first place, but maybe you didn't need it at first. So I'm not saying that's a bad choice. Maybe it made sense. If you're going to convert after a year or two, it's like, well, you probably should just set up a C corp. Of course, hindsight's always 20/20. So I'm not saying that anyone should know this, obviously. But maybe it's a situation where you're a LLC for 5 years, and then it makes sense to make the conversion. So. Any other questions? Yes.
To be able to get the investments to your company or project, what entity should you have?
If you're seeking a lot of outside investment, a C Corp. Yeah, because for a couple reasons. One are it's the without getting into the nitty gritty, I think the infrastructure of a C Corp is best suited for outside investment. But also outside investors, especially institutional investors, they know a C Corp. It's like a known quantity. They don't have to learn a new set of rules. They're probably investing in 10 or 20 C Corps. So rather than learn the rules of your highly customized LLC, they just know, oh yeah, this is how all C Corps work. I don't have to read your bylaws. I don't have to figure out how you set this up. They're all more or less set up the same. Anything else on entities? I'll just leave you with this quote from Benjamin Franklin, which is kind of how I feel about legal advice. You know, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And we do see this all the time where people have some sort of problem and, you know, they skimped on legal fees right off the bat. And I think while lawyers can be expensive, taking a little bit of time to consult a professional can actually save you a lot of headache down the line. So just keep that in mind. Okay, well, I know I'm over time, so thank you all for your patience and getting through this with me.
All of you entrepreneurs, when you go into business for yourself, you're really passionate about what you're good at. You either have a service that you're good at or a product, and you didn't really buy into this. You didn't really buy into accounting and taxes. You didn't really go to college for that. And so different people have different ways of viewing it. Some people look at taxes as just kind of a shakedown. It's like, wait a minute, I earned this money, and then the government wants a portion of it. So I'm hopefully I can shed some light, you know, on taxes, on self-employment, and kind of dismiss some of these misnomers. Now, I was provided with a list of questions, and I have a whole lot to cover, so I'm going to just talk really fast and zoom through a list of questions that was provided to me. And so Patrick was nice enough to kind of like field questions on the fly, but I'll never get through it. So if you'll hold your questions to the end, and then if you see a topic that you're interested in that I didn't cover in depth enough, then just take a note and ask me afterwards. Or even if there's something that's not up here at all, feel free to ask me at the end and we'll cover them. First question. So why form a business? And Patrick covered a little bit of this earlier. You know, I can think of non-legal, non-accounting, non-tax ways to form a business. Some of it is marketing. You basically want to establish a brand. You want to do some advertising. Maybe you want to recruit employees. But there are the, you know, the legal or tax or accounting reasons for starting a business. You'd basically need to keep accurate records, because one day all those records from your accounting are going to fall on a tax return. And so I really encourage people to stay organized and keep track, rather than a shoebox full of receipts that you're going to have to prepare a tax return from. Use a software package. There's a lot of them out there. Now, I mentioned that I work for Intuit. Most people, when you think of Intuit, you probably think of, you know, QuickBooks, TurboTax, Quicken. And we've moved from Quicken to Mint, just because instead of a desktop platform, it's more cloud-based, and that's where everything's going. Our TurboTax product is going to the cloud, QuickBooks going to the cloud. And even Intuit recognizes that folks like yourself, so many people are migrating from what I call W-2 employee status to self-employed or 1099 income. Intuit has even created QBSE, which stands for QuickBooks Self-Employed, for folks just like yourself that are new to self-employment and that need to stay organized, that need to be able to, you know, compile all of their records so that that data can be transferred right onto your tax return. You might find it interesting, some data has been assembled that within the next few years, 40% of America's workforce will be self-employed instead of working as an employee status. So that's the direction it's going. The next question says, what is the City of San Diego Business Certificate, and are self-employed people required to have one? Don't be confused or scared by the word certificate, okay? That basically means that you've complied with the City of San Diego to file an application and get a business license and pay your fees. That's what that means. And you can Google San Diego Business Certificate, and it'll give you the steps to apply online. So everybody doing business in a municipality, meaning an incorporated entity, you need to have a business license, usually a small fee for applying for doing business in a municipality, whether it's San Diego, whether it could be Encinitas, it could be Poway, but you need to have a business license to be able to do business. So what is the difference between a sole proprietorship, LLC, and an S Corp? What other structures are there? So Patrick did an awesome job of addressing, from a legal standpoint, sole proprietorship, LLC, S Corp. What other structures are there? The ones that come to mind would be a partnership and a C Corp that are not listed there. And Patrick did a great job of covering the legal aspects of those. So when he says the corporate veil, think of the corporate shell, the corporate veil, basically protecting you from legal liability. From a tax standpoint, let me address just the tax standpoint real quick. Sole proprietorship, you and your business are the same entity for tax purposes. When you go out, you're rocking and rolling, you're doing business, you're making money, the tax liability that sole proprietorship creates is yours. It's going to fall on a Schedule C on your personal tax return, flow to the face of the 1040, and you will pay taxes on that income as an individual. LLC, interesting, you actually have different check boxes that you can determine in what manner you're going to do business. But as a pass-through or flow-through entity, that income is again going to flow through to you personally. Same thing with an S Corp. What is an S Corp? Well, S came from subchapter S. That's where it got its name in the tax code. So a subchapter S corporation is a corporation, and as Patrick said, you have the corporate veil to protect you from liability. If you get sued, it's the corporation being sued, not you personally. However, it's taxed like a partnership. So within the first 75 days of you starting your S Corp, you can check a box that says, I want to be taxed, okay, as a partnership. I want it to flow through to me personally. The income, the deductions, the credits, all of that flows through on a Form K-1, and that K-1 is added to your personal tax return, and then you pay for it personally rather than at the corporate level. So the two that are not on there on this question, the C Corp, separate legal entity, as Patrick said, but also separate for tax purposes. Hence the double taxation that you've heard about before. So a C Corp pays its own taxes at the corporate level, files a tax return, pays its fees. There's more costs associated with running a C Corp because you have to have your accountant or somebody prepare that corporate return for you. But there's some benefits, and Patrick mentioned them earlier. Some of the other benefits of a C Corp is the continuation of life. If your sole proprietorship, if you passed away, it would end with you. However, if you had a corporation and you passed away, your shares of stock would go to your estate, which would end up with your heirs, and your ownership would continue. Partnership. A partnership is picture in your mind, instead of a sole proprietorship with one owner, there's two or more people form a partnership, and it's a pass-through or flow-through entity, and you're taxed personally in your share of ownership. You could have two people that own 50-50, or three people that own a third each, or 10 people that own a variety of percentages, and that flows through to each one of the partners' personal tax returns, and they pay taxes on it personally. Should I form a business in a state like Delaware? What are my tax responsibilities in that situation? You might find it interesting to know that over 50% of all the Fortune 500 companies are incorporated in Delaware. But I want to point out that those are Fortune 500 companies, and those aren't us in this room, or those aren't people just starting out. The reason that they do it is they work internationally. They work in multiple states because Delaware will not tax you in Delaware for your earnings outside of Delaware. Not so in other states. Also, Delaware doesn't require that you list the owners, which are a matter of public record. So your brain can race wild on why that would be important to you. But Delaware happens to be a state where you're not required to list those owners. And the fees are reasonable, and so a lot of people would incorporate in Delaware. For folks like you starting out, I wouldn't recommend. First of all, you probably don't need a C Corp right off the bat. Most people start working for a year or 2 or 3 until you have some significant income as a sole proprietorship or maybe a partnership with somebody else. And then when the time dictates, you might consider doing that. What is a registered agent? Okay, so a registered agent is a third party that you must designate when you set up a corporation. Someone that can be served with legal documents, someone that can be served with tax documents and other official government documents. You need to have a registered agent that's a matter of public record so that someone that wants to serve you papers knows who to serve them to. That's what a registered agent is. How does income taxes work in general? What does the IRS do? So income taxes, it's interesting. This country was founded by folks that came from England. And one of the things that they wanted when they wrote our Constitution was no taxation without representation. Because when we came from a monarchy, basically the king collected all the taxes and put it in the hopper and spent it on whatever he wanted to. Now we have a form of government where the money is collected, the taxes is collected, and then it has to, a budget is created and money has to be spent for the designated purpose. So how does income taxes work in general? If you're a W-2 employee, you have withholding taken out of your check. If you're self-employed, you make quarterly estimates, which I'll talk about in a moment. Then at the end of the year, your tax return, when you file it, your 1040 for federal, your 540 for California, is really a reconciling document. You're basically saying, hey, the year's done, it's the spring before April 15th, and you declare, this is my income, these are my deductions, and this is my tax liability. And then you indicate, well, I've already paid this much, I've paid too much, I'm due a refund, or I haven't paid enough, I have a balance due. So what does the IRS do? The IRS is basically the government's collection agency. So they are charged with the responsibility to collect taxes for the federal government. What are the branches, what are the brackets, and why do they differ for federal and state? I think I'm going to jump to my appendage a little bit later so I don't get off track here. I can keep up the momentum. So tax brackets, and why are they different from federal and state? So out of the 50 states in the union, 43 states have estate income taxes. And they're not obliged to set them equal to the federal at all. They basically know their own budget. They determine their own revenue and their own expenses. Most states will start with the federal AGI and the adjusted gross income, and then add and subtract expenses that they will they conform with, or items that they do not conform with, to come up with their own state adjusted gross income. And some of them will have a flat tax. They'll just say, we're going to charge you 2.5%, and some of them have a graduated tax rate schedule. So we live in a country with a progressive tax rate schedule. And what I mean by that is that you're not just taxed a certain rate on your total income. So your first $10,000 a year that you earn, you don't pay any taxes on it. You pay 0. And then 15%, then 20%, et cetera. And that changes each year, and I'm going to show you that in a moment. So your marginal, if you ever hear that term, what's my marginal tax rate? That would be your last dollar that you earned at the end of the year, your highest tax rate that you earned. If anybody says, well, what's your effective tax rate? Picture in your mind kind of an average or blended rate. So, if you made $100,000 and $20,000 of it was gone in taxes, you earn a 20% effective tax rate. That's how that works. What is the Franchise Tax Board of California? Okay, good question. So it's really California's, the state counterpart of the IRS. So whenever you think of IRS, think federal. When you think of the Franchise Tax Board, think of California. They basically are charged with the same responsibility. They collect income taxes from citizens of California. Let's keep rolling here. Hopefully I'm not going too fast. What is the difference between W-2 and 1099 employment? Are there other kinds? Well, yes, there's other kinds, but I got to tell you, the W-2 and 1099, this is an excellent question. This might be the most important one of the night here. And Patrick handled, employee versus subcontractor from a legal standpoint and the definitions and how to be one or the other. What I will address is from a tax standpoint, W-2 versus 1099. So if you're a W-2, which a lot of us have experienced here in this room already, you basically are an employee working for an employer that takes withholding out of your check. So you have your gross, then you have these deductions, federal withholding, state withholding, SDI, and Social Security. And if you ever see FICA, F-I-C-A, okay, that's the same thing as Social Security. It's the same thing. 7.65% is being taken out of your paycheck, and then your employer is matching that. It gets up to 15.3% and sending it off to the government. So as a W-2, you are paying as you go throughout the course of the year by way of withholding out of your paycheck every week or every 2 weeks or how often you get paid. So the government really doesn't want to wait till after the year's over for you to pay your taxes. It's not that they don't trust us, it's that they don't trust us. So they want you to pay as you go by way of withholding. But what if you're a 1099? What if you're a subcontractor? So your gross and the net are exactly the same. So whatever your employer, or in this case, a contractor paying a subcontractor, whatever is due you, they're just going to pay you. The tax responsibility is all yours. It's all yours. And you have to kind of get a new mindset that that's not all mine. It's difficult for some folks where the money goes into your checking account and it's there, and what you're required to do is make quarterly tax estimates. And that may be a very foreign term to some of you in the room here. Like, what the heck is quarterly tax estimates? But April, June, September, and then January of the following year, on those 4 dates, you're supposed to estimate the amount of tax liability that you're going to have, write a check, send it off the IRS for your federal, and the Franchise Tax Board for your state. Then when you file your tax return at the end of the year, there's a portion right on there. What quarterly estimates have you already made? You fill that in and you get credit for it. It reduces your tax liability. So if some of you have more questions on quarterly estimates, I wouldn't blame you. We can kind of field those on the Q&A because that's a really important distinction for self-employed individuals. How far did we get? What is the Schedule C? What can I deduct? Okay, excellent questions. So your tax return is laid out like this. You got a 1040, and then the schedules are put out in alphabetical order, A, B, C, D, E. And then the numerical ones follow that in numerical order. So a Schedule C is for sole proprietorships. So your income and your deductions for your self-employed business, for your sole proprietorship, all fall on Schedule C. And the net, this is really important for those of you taking notes, the net income on your Schedule C is subject to self-employment tax. Now that might be a new term for some of you, and it sounds like a dirty, nasty word, like self-employment tax. Like, are you kidding me? They're going to tax me on my self-employment? And I'll drill down on that a little bit later. So your net income from self-employment is subject to self-employment tax. Self-employment tax, yep, is in addition to your regular income taxes. So you will pay income taxes on your taxable income, and then you'll pay self-employment tax both on your tax return, okay, for self-employment. Can I deduct my computer, my rent, my bills, my video games, food, gas, software, license, health insurance, etc.? The answer to what can I deduct is this. You can absolutely deduct anything and everything that you spend in the production of your income. So let me define that a little bit better for you. You can't deduct personal expenses, but if you spend money that helps you produce the income of that particular business, it's deductible. And there's one small exception to that. The tax code reads, unless it's against public policy. So what does that mean, against public policy? That basically just means like a fine or a penalty. Those are not deductible. So if you get a speeding ticket zooming down I-5, not deductible. Okay. Other than that, can I deduct my computer, my rent? This one says bills. That's kind of a general term. Video games. So anything and everything that you spend in production of the income from your business is tax deductible. Now there's different ways to deduct capitalized items, and I won't spend a whole lot of time on that, but you can't just write off a car all at once. We call it capitalizing and depreciating over an estimated useful life. That's where that word depreciation comes from, and you can ask me more about that if you want me to go in more detail. So what is a standard deduction? And I'm going to show you that again in one of the appendages in a minute. Everybody is entitled to a certain amount depending on your filing status. And it's different depending on whether you're single, head of household, married filing joint, married filing separate. It's going to be a different standard deduction. And with this new tax reform in 2018, part of Trump's initiatives that those pretty much almost double. So it used to be that we all got a standard deductions unless our itemized deductions, Schedule A, itemized deductions exceeded our standard deduction. And then you took the greater of the two, whatever's most. And it just in practical application, if you don't own a home, if you don't have a mortgage that you're deducting, it's very difficult to itemize your deductions. So most folks that are renting that don't have a Schedule A itemized deductions take the standard deduction. So we have all of our sources of income, then we have adjustments down to adjusted gross income, and then we deduct a standard deduction to get it to taxable income. And from taxable income, you go to the tax tables and figure out what your tax liability is. And then from there, you can subtract credits, and you can subtract any quarterly estimates or withholding that you made, and that comes down to the refund or balance due. That's how the form flows. So this one says, how might my tax responsibility change in 2018? Well, that's kind of a two-pronged question. Number one, if your situation changed, meaning I went from a W-2 to self-employed, or I have more deductions or less income, well, that's going to affect your tax return, isn't it? But if everything was exactly the same, let me address the question that way. With tax reform, we've actually done some simulations. We've run thousands of tax returns of 2017 data through the computer. And for the most part, you would owe less taxes in 2018 as a result of tax reform than you would in 2017. And I can show you the different tax rates in a moment here. What records should I keep and for how long? Excellent question. So you definitely should keep your tax returns. They don't take up a whole lot of room. And for the most part, nowadays, people are going paperless anyway. The statute of limitations is 3 years. The IRS and Franchise Tax Board, they're not supposed to be able to audit you beyond 3 years back from the date of filing, unless they suspect fraud, and then there is no statute of limitations. They can go back as far as they want. I would tell you that as a rule, instead of just 3 years of tax returns, I'd keep 7 years of tax returns. And another thing that's very important for you to keep, if you ever bought a piece of real estate, there's probably an escrow statement somewhere, save that. One day, you're going to sell that piece of property, and your gain or loss on that piece of real estate, whether it's your home, whether it's your rental property, a second home, if you bought a piece of real estate, the escrow company is going to generate an escrow statement for you, and your tax preparer is really going to need that to calculate gain or loss on the sale of that piece of real estate. This one says, who can help me prepare my taxes? I'm not sure if you meant credentialed. Basically, I guess anybody that's knowledgeable about tax return prep can help you. A CPA, an EA stands for Enrolled Agent. They've passed an exam before the IRS that shows that they can operate before the IRS and prepare tax returns. So who can help me prepare my taxes? Pretty much anybody that's knowledgeable can help you, but in order to electronically file with the IRS or Franchise Tax Board, they have to have what's called an ERO, which means that they've been registered with the IRS or Franchise Tax Board to electronically file the returns. I know I'm going kind of quick, but we can revisit these if we need to. How do I pay? I believe this question basically is, how do I pay my taxes? I think that's probably what that means. And as I said earlier, if you are a W-2 employee, you are paying by virtue of withholding out of your paycheck. Now you can alter that by changing the W-4 that's on file, how many exemptions, whether you're married or single, or 10 exemptions or 1 exemption, you can alter the amount of withholding that you're paying out of your paycheck. If you're self-employed, you pay by quarterly estimates, as I mentioned earlier. So you create these vouchers that are due 4 times a year for federal and for California. And then, like I said, you'll get credit for that when you file your tax return. How do business taxes work? So the thing is that a C corp, a regular corporation, has its own taxes that I would refer to as business taxes. The rest of these entities that are listed here, a sole proprietorship, an LLC, an S corp, they are all. The very next question says, what is the pass-through? So all 3 of those, really a sole proprietorship, you're paying taxes personally. LLC, S corp, any taxes, liability that's generated from you operating your business will flow through to you personally, and you'll pay it on your personal tax return. What if my business is in another state? So basically, you're going to have what is called a tax home. What state do you reside in? So if you reside in California, California is kind of like the federal government. The federal government wants you to claim your worldwide income. So if you have income from anywhere in the world, your federal government wants it on your return. California is the same way. California says, if you're a resident of California, we want you to claim everything here. Now, if you earn money in another state, that state also wants you to claim it and file a state tax return, provided it's one of the 43 states that have an income taxes. Some of them don't, Nevada, Texas, Florida. That's why some people retire to Florida, retire to Nevada, because there's no state taxes there. Now here's the good news. It sounded like you were being double taxed the way I described it. When I said your worldwide income for federal purposes, if you work for a foreign government or foreign entity in another country, and they required you to file a tax return in that country and pay that tax, okay, you're going to get what's called, a foreign income tax credit. So even though your IRS wants you to pay taxes on your income, you'll get a credit for the taxes you already paid in the foreign country. Same thing with states. Let's just say that you worked in Oregon and you live in California, and Oregon wanted you to pay taxes there, so you filed an Oregon return and you paid taxes in Oregon. On your California return, you actually get a credit for the taxes you paid to the other state, so that you're not double taxed. That's how that works. So what if you're a professional baseball player and you're playing baseball in all those other states? You got to file a tax return in all those other states? Yep. You can imagine these pro baseball players filing all those tax returns in all those other states that they went and played a few games in. Overseas, I answered that one. I added a couple more to the end here. I just took the liberty to add a couple questions here. I'm okay on time? How am I doing? These are a couple questions that I would want to ask if I were in your shoes. So, what are the most common mistakes people make when starting their own business? Typically, what happens is that people are excited to get busy and start making some money. Okay, people they're passionate about it, they're really good at it, and the first thing you do is want to just go out and start doing what you're good at. And then accounting is like a second thought, and you actually get down the road and go, oh yeah, maybe I should have done that, or maybe I should have done this. And I really encourage you to start off being excessively organized. And one of the ways to do that is separate your personal life from the business life, okay? Now, Kojo mentioned it earlier as far as just a mentality and your friends, and you did an awesome job of separating that on that mindset. But in terms of your paperwork, your checking account, your credit card, keep them separate. Have a separate credit card just for work stuff, okay? You might have a separate checking or separate savings. Most people don't do that. They commingle it all, and then, oh my gosh, they have to go back and try to recreate that. And you're doing your day job, and then you're spending your evenings at the kitchen table going through receipts and wishing you had not. Use a software package. There's a bunch of them out there, whether it's QuickBooks Self-Employed, and keep in mind, Quicken and Mint are made to organize your personal finances. QuickBooks is made to organize your business, and so it's set up entirely different. I won't bore you with single entry accounting versus double entry accounting, but QuickBooks is designed for running a business, and the other two are designed to just handle your groceries and your personal life, okay? So the most common mistake I would say is that not being organized and commingling your activities and having accounting or taxes being an afterthought instead of a forethought. When should I start thinking about savings for retirement? What are my options? So what's interesting is that normally when I'm speaking to a bunch of young folks, it's like the furthest thing from their mind. They're like, you know what? I'll wait till later. I'm going to be really, really successful, and I'm going to make a lot of money later, and then I'll stash some money aside then. I'll do it then. That's kind of like, I use baseball analogies because I love baseball. That's kind of like saying, don't score any runs for the first 8 runs because in the 9th inning, I'm going to hit a grand slam. I'm going to be fine. I'll just hit a grand slam. And that's really risky. It's really risky. The most impactful example that was given to me when I was younger, and maybe some of you have already seen this, they did a math example. Let's just say the two of you are both 20 years old right now, okay? And you decide, did I walk out of that camera? Sorry. You followed me. You decide, I'm going to put $2,000 into an IRA every year starting at 20 for the next 7 years. And you say, heck with that, I want to party. Okay, I'm not going to save. I got other things in mind. I'll worry about it later. You stop after 7 years and never put another dime in. You start at age 28 and put $2,000 a year in all the way to retirement. At the end, he's got more money. And it just speaks loudly to the compounding of interest. And so all I would say to you guys is start early and be diligent about it. I'll tell you, how many of you, let me give you an example. This is I'll end with this. This is my random act of kindness for tonight. How many of you can come up with $20 a week? Raise your hand. $20 a week. Okay, not all of you are raising your hand. We'll be here all night. Everybody can come up with $20. Patrick, 20? Okay. You put that in a Roth IRA every week. And I know what you guys are thinking. If some of you math whiz out there, you're thinking $20 a week. What's that? 52 weeks in a year. What's that? $1,040. $1,040. 35 years. That's $35,000. Now, come on, Jeff. That's not much money. Wrong. That'll be worth $250,000. I've done the math. And one of it, the big part of that is that with a Roth IRA, your earnings are tax-free. And when you take the money out, it's tax-free. So when you guys retire and you're down there in the Caribbean, thinking back about tonight, sucking on your umbrella drink, and your toes are in the warm sand, you can think back about tonight and think about, I want you to do 2 things. Number 1, tell somebody else about that and have another young person start doing that. And the other thing that you should do is have a second umbrella drink. So I'm done. Thank you very much. So I zoomed through really, really quick. Some of these topics, if I didn't cover them deep enough, feel free to ask me now, and I can go a little deeper. Or if there's something up there that I did not cover, feel free to ask me. Yes, sir?
So some of us who used to be employees, we had 401ks, but we left, and they've just been sitting there. And do you have any advice on what we could do with those?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Many, many people are in that same situation where I had a 401k, and now I'm left, and now what do I do? And you know, even though I shouldn't give you investment advice, I can tell you that you can actually roll that 401k into an IRA and not pay a dime tax on it. Just don't take a distribution. Don't take any in your hand, because that would be what they call a premature distribution from a sheltered retirement account, and there's tax penalties and interest on doing that. So I wouldn't recommend you taking the money, but you can roll that over. Another thing you could consider, and it depends on the employer and their policy, but I mean, if you like where it's at, and you have it's self-driven, meaning that you're in charge of how it's invested, you might be able to leave it there. It depends on the employer. But I'd consider rolling that money over into an IRA. Other questions?
So for depreciating assets, is there a certain value at which something becomes depreciating? Like if you're buying a more expensive car than another, is it the type of asset that you're getting? And what is the classification to which something becomes depreciating or not? Like for example, if I buy a $500 tablet or a $500 computer, would those be depreciating? If I bought a $500 car, would that be depreciating, or is that something I could just write off? A pretty cheap car. But could I just write the whole thing off?
Yeah, so excellent question. And I wish depreciation was a shorter topic. I could spend an hour on that, but I'll try to capsulize it for you. There's a lot of different rules. There's bonus depreciation, which means you can write off an asset on the first year, Section 179. I won't bore you with sections, but Section 179 basically is a manner in which you can write off a capital asset on the first year. But in general, your company establishes what's called a capitalization policy, and it's a dollar figure. Let's just say it's $100. So if you buy a screwdriver, it's $5, you're going to write it off. You can buy something for $50, you're going to write it off. You buy something that costs more money. Now, your capitalization policy for your company could be $500. Anything over $500, I'm going to capitalize. And it really has to do with something that has an estimated useful life of more than an accounting period. So what is an accounting period? So it's a year. So whether you're on a calendar year basis or a fiscal year, if your asset is something that's going to last, like a car or like a computer, several years, and the cost is $1,000, you are required to capitalize that and then depreciate it over its estimated useful life. And it can be straight line depreciation. There's different, I won't bore you with the different methods of depreciation. There's accelerated depreciation methods, which means you get more in the early years and less in the later years, which are probably kind of true, because I mean, when you drive a car off the lot, it depreciates faster in the first year than in the later years, so that kind of makes sense. There's different depreciation methods and there's different lives. For example, a car may be 5-year depreciation period, but you're not going to have a house that's a 5-year depreciation period. It's going to be 30 years. And so there's tables that show you the list of assets, the methods, and the estimated useful life of those assets. Excellent question. Did you have a question too?
Actually, I have a couple of questions.
Okay.
I'm not a resident of California or United States. I'm from different country.
Mm-hmm.
But I still would like to work here like as freelancer or independent contractor.
Uh-huh.
So here's some basic questions from top of my head. First one, if I'm an employee here, should I pay like income taxes?
Absolutely.
Right.
Okay, and it's called an NR, stands for non-resident.
Uh-huh.
And so you're required to file a 1040 NR, non-resident, and California wants you to file a non-resident. So if you're here working in this country or working in the state of California, they want you to pay income taxes on your earnings.
Okay, so second question would be, if I do like independent contractor jobs or whatever, just working with clients, and I ended up at the end of the year with like less than $2,000 on my account, should I supposed to file? And I'm a household, just head of household. Should I supposed to file my taxes?
So I think what your question is alluding to is there minimum filing requirements?
Yeah.
I think that's what you're asking me. So if, believe it or not, if you earn $10, you're supposed to pay taxes on the $10, okay? However, as I mentioned to you earlier, we all get a standard deduction, which would be more than the $2,000. And whether you're head of household or not is really another discussion, because whether you qualify for head of household has to do with whether you have a dependent in the house and whether you're married and a whole other shopping list of rules. But in the case of someone that's head of household that had less than $10,000 worth of income for the whole year, you're below the filing requirements. However, a lot of people file anyway, because if you ever had an employer that had some withholding out of your paycheck, you'd get that back. And there are some what they call refundable credits. We have non-refundable credits, which basically reduce your taxes to zero. And then we have refundable credits that go beyond zero. And the earned income credit is a particular credit that is refundable. And what that means is that you could file a tax return, and let's say you didn't pay any taxes at all, no quarterly estimates, no withholding, but you get a nice refund from a refundable credit like the earned income credit. So I would definitely at least consider, I mean, you could play with the TurboTax program. A lot of people do. You just go into TurboTax and drop your situation in, and then watch the refund monitor tumble and see where you stand. So I definitely wouldn't miss the opportunity. You might get refunds that you're unaware of.
Okay, and the last question would be, if I'm not like a contractor or employee, I just do some stuff on the internet, like just streaming on Twitch, for example, just playing games and getting donations from other people. Does it qualify like income or something?
Well, a gift or a donation is not. I mean, or an investment into your company is not income. If you did something, if you provided a service and there was some enumeration, that's income. And there are some certain rules about self-employment. You would think that, you know, if you had a standard deduction that offset all of your income, you're fine. But if you earn more than $400 in self-employment income, they want you to pay the self-employment taxes. So there's two types of taxes at play here.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
I just have a quick question about when you said when you deal business in other states, and you gave the analogy with the baseball players playing games in other states and having to be accountable for taxes in those states. I have a question in regards to like digital distribution of software or I guess games, for example. If you sell your software or game on the internet and someone's buying it all over the world, are you accountable for the taxes in those other places, or?
Oh, good question. And my answer not only is really to both of your questions here. For the most part, when you are required to pay taxes, you will get a tax document in the mail. And it could be a W-2, it could be a 1099 miscellaneous, it could be some other form of 1099, it could be a K-1. If you're doing business with somebody and they're paying you, they have requirements to send you a form, and I have to tell you that a copy of that form is going to the IRS and the Franchise Tax Board. And this might be more than you asked, but let me just share it for everybody's benefit here. There is a matching process that takes place with the IRS and the Franchise Tax Board. So any document that you get, W-2, 1099, any document you get, a computer does the matching process to see if you filed it and included it on your tax return. In fact, and you'll get a nasty gram from the IRS, that's what we call them. It's a CP2000. And it even says CP2000 right at the top right-hand corner. CP stands for computer process, meaning no human being was even involved in it. But if your employer, somebody that paid you money, sent a copy of the form off to the government, and you don't include it in your tax return, they will catch it. They will catch it and send you a notice that, hey, by the way, you did not include this on your tax return, so we are going to add tax penalties and interest for the income that you did not include. So with regards to your question, it really has to do with the payer, person paying you the money, and whether they submitted a form to you. You know, if you're providing a service and getting paid for it, the down and dirty answer is yes, that should be included on your tax return.
I mean, even if it's entirely like online, there's no like.
There's no distinction whether it's online or not online. If you're, I mean, I don't know what means you're being paid, whether it's, you know, electronic or a check or Venmo. I'm not sure how you're getting paid, but you know, even electronic payments now are being regulated. There's a form called a 1099-K now, and so like all the Uber drivers that are paid by Uber electronically get a 1099-K showing this is the amount of money that we paid you. And the government's going to be looking at your tax return to make sure you included it on your tax return.
If you're going through a platform like the App Store, like Steam, or IGDA, or something like a store, they'll provide that information for you. If you're selling it yourself, like on your personal website, I don't know if you have different responsibilities in that case.
Yeah, that was more what I was.
Maybe you just have
Like a website, and anyone could maybe use PayPal or something from all over the world to buy it. I don't know if I'm wording this properly or not.
Well, I mean, even PayPal is monitored as well as far as the amount of money, and you know, the IRS even has a way of monitoring your checking account to see. You know, some of my clients have been called in asking about a deposit, you know, into their checking account, and they had to explain, well, it was just a transfer from my savings to the checking, but they wanted to tax them on every single deposit going into their checking account. So it is, they do have a way of auditing you and monitoring that. I mean, again, the short down and dirty answer is that, you know, you provide a service and you get paid for it, it's taxable income. Other questions?
So give me 1 second so I know where to start. So let's say I am an independent contractor, or let's say I am doing dealings with a LLC or an S corp, and a liquidity event happens for this S corp or LLC, and let's say I have a copyright on my work for something I have done for the LLC and S corp. I guess this is also a question for Patrick too as well. So it's going to be a little bit of a intermingled question. So, but as a business, the business has an amortized loan in order to pay their independent contractors, their employees. Does the business one have to pay interest marginally for that amortized loan, even though they're filing for Chapter 11? And how is the copyright then invalid if the LLC or S corp is filing for Chapter 11 and it's unable to pay their contractors, their employees? Does the contractor or employee own the copyright now?
I think that's a Patrick question more than a tax question. Where I thought you were going, and let me just answer it for the benefit of anybody. I thought I heard the word liquidation right at the beginning of your comments. And, you know, if an entity ever liquidated and there was a payout to you, if your question was, is that taxable to me? Do I have to pay taxes on this money coming out to me? And my answer to you would be yes, minus any basis that you might have. And that word basis might be a foreign word to some of you, but if you had invested into the business, you had bought stock, then that would be a return of capital. And so the portion that's coming back to you that's called basis, a return of capital, is not taxable, and any amount in excess of that's called gain, and it would be taxable. Now there is something called capital gain, which is a preferred tax rate, meaning that if you held it for more than a year, there's some preferred tax benefit for capital gains versus ordinary gains. As far as the bankruptcy question, Patrick, I don't know if you can field that one for him or not.
And for exchange rates, I'm assuming they're taxed marginally.
What's that?
For I guess whenever you're paid and there's exchange rates involved, let's say you're working in a different country, I'm assuming they're taxed marginally as well.
I'm not sure I understood your question. If you're working in a different country,
Yeah.
you're taxed as well?
No, you're taxed marginally if the entity you're working for is in a different country. The exchange rate for deductions for how you're taxed, and then I believe you said there's like a foreign exchange something. I forgot the name of it.
Yeah, so foreign earned income credit.
Thank you.
And basically what that is, I pay taxes in another country. I can enter that as a credit on my domestic return. So on my United States 1040, if I paid taxes in a foreign country, I can enter that as a credit. Because if I didn't, there'd be double taxation. I have to claim my worldwide income on my personal return here, and that foreign country made me pay taxes on that same income. So if I didn't get a credit on my 1040 here, I'd be paying double taxes.
Okay.
Any other questions?
This question is more of a curiosity because I have spoken, at least recently, to a couple of other production artists and whatnot. But there was kind of an in-joke about whether or not it would be worth accepting cryptocurrency as payment for services rendered. And I know we've been dealing a lot with obvious, we exchange money in American dollars here in the U.S. But how would one claim something like, it might be a bigger conversation, but how does someone claim something as large or as vacuous as cryptocurrency on a tax return, and how, in the event that I would accept that, I wouldn't, but how would I even start that process? Would I need to speak to a CPA who has experience in dealing with online currency? I mean, it's not even technically real money.
Our tax returns are all in U.S. currency. And so the first thing that would happen on any foreign currency, or the type that you're discussing here, is a conversion. And so the conversion would have to take place and then to U.S. dollars, and then U.S. dollars is the only currency used on our returns. So I'm not that familiar with what you're discussing, but if you ask me the same question about euros or pounds or francs, my answer would be the same, that it'd have to be converted to U.S. dollars and then reported. Okay. I'm surprised nobody asked about this last one right here. What are my options?
What are my options?
Thank you. He's a plant. I put him there. So, somebody asked a very good question about 401k. So 401k, is when you're working for somebody as an employee, it's an excellent vehicle to plan for retirement, because they're putting money aside in a savings account for you that's building, and you didn't pay taxes on that money. Now when you take it out, you have to pay taxes on it when you take it out on a 401k. But 401k, excellent vehicle, and if you leave that employer, you can roll it over into an IRA. But what about other options? What's the difference? I mean, I'm surprised you didn't ask. What's the difference between a Roth IRA and a traditional IRA? Or do we even care when we're so young? Thank you. See? Okay, so traditional IRA, you put money in and you take a deduction from it on your taxes right now. So cool. I can take money and the government's going to give me a tax deduction for putting money in to my own retirement account for me. Why would they even do that? Well, they probably don't. Traditional, thank you. So traditional IRA, deductible when you put it in, and then taxable to you when you take it out. And the earnings on it, also taxable to you when you take it out. traditional IRA. And so why would they do that? I mean, my theory is that they really don't want all of us on the Social Security system when we're old and gray, okay? So if they can put vehicles in place in the private sector for us to save for our own retirement, then there's less of us that need the government subsidy or government Social Security program. So what about a Roth IRA? What's the difference? A Roth IRA, you put the money in, no deduction. However, the earnings grow tax-free, and when you take the money out, the money you put in and all the earnings, tax-free. So, a couple different theories on that. One of them is that some people would advocate a traditional IRA. Why? Well, right now I'm young, I'm earning a bunch of money, I'm rocking and rolling, I really need the deduction, don't I? And when I'm old and gray and all I have is my pension, my income, I'll be in such a low income bracket at that point in time that I won't mind paying taxes on the income at that time. Okay, so that's one argument. The other argument was the one I gave you earlier when I was advocating that you guys put $20 a week into a Roth IRA. It speaks loudly to the power of the compounding of interest, and all of those gains over all those years and years and years are growing, because if you're paying taxes on those earnings, there'd be less to grow. There'd be less interest to accrue. And so there's the argument for a Roth IRA, although it's a little more painful to take money and put it aside and not get a tax deduction for it. When you retire, you'd be glad you did the Roth IRA versus the other one. Here's another little trick that I can't believe I'm going to share this with you right now, but I do this for some of my clients, okay? There's a window of opportunity between January 1st and April 15th for you to fund an IRA and designate it for last year. So the year has ended, and for the most part, when clients come to me and they go, hey, can we do some tax planning? I'm all, really? Why didn't you come to me in November and December? You're coming to me in the spring and you're wanting to do tax planning now? The die is cast. But there's a few little exceptions to that rule, and one of them is that what I'm alluding to now is that you fund an IRA in the spring and you designate it for last year. But you have to fund it before April 15th. Well, file your tax return right in February and designate that you're going to make a deduction for last year. So your refund just went up. Chances are you'll get the refund from the government before you have to fund your IRA, right? So think about that. Designate it for last year, wait around a few weeks, get the money, and then go to the bank and then fund your IRA before April 15th. Just one little tax planning strategy. Other questions from anybody?
So for some programmers, I know that what they do is they will sub-license their work where rather than doing work for hire, I am giving you a perpetual, license to use this software I am developing. Then essentially the software is the product. So any new methods I develop, in the course of working for you are mine. You can use them in your game or whatever, but if I find a new way to, render graphics or do sorting or whatever, that belongs to me, but I'm giving you a license to use that. That can be a very specific approach to doing it. Some other developers, I think his name is Sean Barrett, he's a pretty famous programmer, at least on Twitter. What he does for the general components that he develops is he open sources them. So if he comes up with a general solution to a library, he just puts it out there in the public. So the client doesn't, so no one owns it in a sense, but then he gets to retain that ownership because he says, okay, this is a good generic library for doing X, Y, Z. I'm going to release it publicly so this client doesn't own it explicitly. This is something that I was realizing later towards my freelancing days when I was using Unity a lot. Then at a certain point I realized oh, these are a bunch of convenient functions that I'm going to use all the time when I'm working with different clients. And I wondered if it would be an issue. So I asked the client who I had, who was a programmer themselves, if I could renegotiate the contract to have a perpetual license to the generic components, which again is kind of vague, and I'm not sure if that would have used more definition. Typically, I think it would be more of an issue if someone would want to come after you for something, like if you came up with some kind of brilliant algorithm that they would think is unique. But it could be dicey. Let's say you come up with a way to save and load files, that might be pretty immaterial to what the game does. Or they could argue, well, actually, since you're able to save and load these files so fast, it makes our game uniquely competitive, therefore you can't use this in some other situation. So I do think it is something you'd want to list in the contract to some extent. Yeah. And I had a question for you also, Jeff.
Sure.
As a good rule of thumb, about how much of a 1099 net income do you think someone should set aside for taxes? I would try to be pretty conservative myself. Like, if I get a paycheck for $1,000, I would tell myself, like, this is only $600, right? Like, and I'm going to put 40% away. Is that too much? Is that too little? Like, do you think of approaching it that way, or maybe something more specific?
Well, I'm going to sound like Patrick when I say it depends, okay? And because the answer is it depends on a lot of circumstances. We actually do, I mean, just earlier today, we had someone say, can you calculate my quarterly estimates for you? And I actually like what you're doing a lot. You know, you're taking, and 40% sounds pretty healthy to me. You know, California, we're like the highest tax in the union. You know, it used to be 9.6% was the maximum tax rate, you know, and now it's higher than that for California. But some states are 5%, some are 2.5%. We're so lucky we live here in the Sunshine State, so we pay a sunshine tax here for living here. But keep in mind that even though, you know, one thing I didn't share with you guys is the appendages. I'll show that to you now. The tax rates themselves. Let me see if I can get there. This was you guys. I was going to say good luck to you guys making a lot of money. So these were the standard deductions, and I wanted to show you these real quick. I know I'm jumping around, but I know you guys can keep up with me. Do you see the single? It used to be $6,350. Now it's $12,000. So do you see what happened with tax reform for the year 2018? And married filing joint, $24,000. These are huge amounts for a tax guy to even see, and that's what Trump's tax reform did. Is he pretty much almost doubled the standard deduction. Now there's a couple other tweaks that you should be aware of. He actually doubled the child tax credit too, from $1,000 to $2,000. That's a big deal, but he eliminated the personal exemption credit. So there's some gives and some takeaways. The other thing I wanted to show you here is, do you see what I highlighted in yellow? And 2017 is on the right. I wish it was reversed, but 2017 is on the right, 2018 is on the left. And keep in mind, this is for a single taxpayer, so it'd be different for head of household, married filing joint, married filing separate. But if you guys are curious, you can see the single person standard deduction went from $6,350 to $12,000. And the reason that's important is because you're not taxed on your gross income. You're not even taxed on your adjusted gross income. You're taxed on your taxable income after the standard deduction has been subtracted. But take a look. Do you see the 10 and the 10 look pretty close? But now all of a sudden 15 is going down to 12, 25 to 22, 28 to 24, 33 to 32, 35 is about the same. But this one here, 39.6 maximum federal tax rate, is down to 37. So I guess if you were making $500,000 a year or $1 million a year, then you would have been in the 39.6. And the only reason I point this out is that when people say, oh, it's for the rich or whatever, this might be what they're referring to, is the maximum tax rate has been reduced. But when you start doubling the standard deduction, which most folks are in that don't have a mortgage, if you don't itemize deduction, then you're going to do a standard deduction. You just got it doubled. So to answer, go back to your question, I really like what you're thinking in that I'm going to take whatever money I have and I'm going to set aside a portion of it. But if you were making, I don't know, $50,000 to $75,000 a year, I mean, you can look at this chart, you know, for yourself, and what tax bracket are you going to be in? You know, 22%. And let's take California. Let's add another 5%. Yeah, you're at 27. I mean, 30. You took 40%, and that's not even a blended. You might be looking at most about 25% that you'd need to set aside to pay your taxes. Does that make sense? Is that helpful?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Very much.
The question over here?
So you've been talking about itemized deductions quite a lot. So I know the IRS sometimes does audits on these itemized deductions, where they will require you to have on your tax return to file your receipts. Is there, in your experience, have been a certain how often does that happen, and how high does your itemized deductions normally need to be in order for an audit to occur? Your experience.
So, part of your question is like, do I have to keep a receipt? And if I get audited, what evidence do I need to produce? So I know I kind of rephrased your question a little bit. You don't have to actually keep a physical receipt. Nowadays, your softwares take a picture of it. Store it paperless. Store it as part of your QuickBooks. They have a means now where you can just take a picture of a receipt and store it right in your register. Very cool. If they audit you, you're supposed to have the fancy word is substantiation. So substantiation basically means is that you have evidence that you spent that money. But your evidence could be your checkbook register. It could be your credit card statement. There's a lot of ways to show evidence that I had that. In terms of like what is too much and when are they going to audit you, they audit particular areas that are abused. So travel and entertainment is a high area for audits. Okay, it's been abused. Entertainment, corporate lunches, and those are the areas that get looked at the most. In terms of, what's too much, when you itemize your deductions, like I told you earlier, if you have a house, then you have a mortgage. And if you have a mortgage, let's just say you pay just $2,000 a month. Most all of that's interest. 2 times 12 is $24,000. $24,000, you're instantly on Schedule A itemizing your deductions, and then it opens up other itemized deductions. You're going to deduct your property taxes, okay? Medical is very difficult to deduct, but charitable contributions, even if you put $5 on the plate every Sunday, that's tax deductible for you. You give clothing to the Goodwill, that's tax deductible for you on Schedule A as an itemized deduction. In terms of like somebody overinflating to the point where they're going to be audited, they do statistical analysis and they know when something looks fishy or it looks exaggerated. If you're making $20,000 a year and your mortgage is $24,000 a year, something's fishy, and you're asking for trouble. So Schedule C, you have $100,000 worth of income on your Schedule C and $100,000 worth of deductions, and you didn't make any money at all. Something's fishy. You'll be audited on that Schedule C. Make sense?